Today's episode is a doozy, because today we're covering one of the worst creatures ever, the infamous grave robber and phantom ghoul, Ed Gein. Here's your trigger warning for this episode. We're gonna be dealing with a lot of corpses, butchering, and sewing, if you catch my drift. Let's dig in. Edward Theodore Gein was born in Wisconsin on August 27, 1906. Ed Gein had a very controlling mother, along with a father who struggled with booze. Apparently, Ed's mom was fanatically religious and would warn her sons constantly about the sins of carnal lust and desire. Mom, I'm 7. I don't even know what that means. Ed's mom moved the family to a farm when he was 9, and by that point, Ed pretty much only left the farm when he went to school. Other than school, family time was all the time. When he wasn't at school, Ed spent most of his time doing chores on the farm. All the while, his mother preached to her boys about the immorality of the world, the evils of drinking, and her belief that all women, apart from herself, were naturally promiscuous and instruments of the devil. Aw man, how did she find out our secret? Every afternoon, Ed's mom forced her 2 sons to sit with her while she read to them from the Bible, usually selecting verses from the Old Testament and Book of Revelations. You know, anything concerning fatalities, destruction, and divine retribution were usually her favorites. In school, Ed was a shy guy, and his classmates and teachers all described him as having strange mannerisms. He would allegedly burst into laughter super randomly, almost as if he was laughing at his own jokes. And to add insult to injury, his mother would punish Eddie if he tried to make any friends, so he kept to himself and was friendless. What do you get when you cross an intelligent, antisocial boy with a traumatically religious mother and a booze-motivated father? A man so terrifying, he would inspire horror movie villains for decades to come. In 1940, Ed's dad passed from his addiction, so Ed and his older brother Henry started working odd jobs to support the fam bam. The brothers were considered generally reliable and honest by the neighborhood, and they both worked as handymen, while Ed frequently babysat for neighbors, despite his sometimes odd and creepy behavior. Ed seemed to relate more easily with children than to other adults, though. But when Henry planned to move in with this divorced mom of 2 that he had been dating, he started to worry about leaving Ed behind. He was also getting increasingly concerned about Ed's attachment to his mother. Ed was high-key obsessed with his mommy, and if this is starting to sound like Norman Bates from Psycho, that's because it is. Norman's character was entirely inspired by Gein the Obscene. Henry regularly badmouthed their mom around Ed, who always seemed to be very shocked and hurt by these statements. A few years went by with Ed and Henry supporting the family until one day in 1944, the brothers were burning brush on the property when the fire apparently got out of control. The local fire department arrived, and by the end of the day, the fire was extinguished, and Ed reported his brother missing. A search party gathered with lanterns and flashlights and searched for Henry, who they finally found lying face down on the property. It looked like he had been expired for some time, and it didn't look like he'd been burned in the fire. At first, they assumed the cause was something like heart failure, but it was later reported that Henry had bruises on his head. The police dismissed the possibility of foul play, but the county coroner later listed the official COD as asphyxiation. No official investigation or autopsy was ever performed, but once Ed's other crimes came to light, people weren't so certain that this was an accident after all. I wonder if he was inspired by the story of Cain and Abel that his mom read to him growing up. Like I mentioned before, Ed was obsessively devoted to his mother, and now it was just the 2 of them alone in the house. Ed's mom had a paralyzing stroke after Henry was gone, and Ed became even more devoted to taking care of her all himself. Once she had a second stroke, her health started to deteriorate quite rapidly after that, and she passed that same year in 1945. Ed was absolutely shattered. The author who wrote Ed Gein's biography about his life put it best when he said he had lost his only friend and one true love, and he was absolutely alone in the world. Now, Ed lived completely alone on the 155-acre farm. Ed left his mother's room neat and untouched, while the rest of the house became a hot mess. He also boarded up rooms that had been used by his mom, including the upstairs floor, downstairs parlor, and a living room, leaving them preserved like a museum. Ed moved into a small room next to the kitchen during this time, while the rest of the house fell into squalor. During this time was when he also started to develop his interest in anatomy books, pulp magazines, and stories involving cannibalism and Nazi crimes. And during the next few years, a few residents from the general area would mysteriously disappear. Ed would finally be found out when a woman named Bernice Warden was reported missing from her hardware store in 1957. At the scene, the cash register was missing, and a trail of red splatters led out to the back of the store. A resident reported that they saw the store's truck had been driven out from the back of the building that morning. Bernice's son was a deputy sheriff, and he was immediately suspicious of the reclusive Gein. He told the investigators that Ed had been at his mother's store the night before his mom's disappearance, and that he came back the next morning for a gallon of antifreeze. They found the receipt for the antifreeze dated the morning she disappeared, and that same day, Ed was caught and arrested at a local grocery store. The authorities sent to search the Gein farm that night were greeted with an image that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They found Bernice's body. Brace yourselves, it's bad. She was found headless, gutted, and hanging from the ceiling upside down. She'd been taken out by Ed's .22 caliber, and they described the way he had mutilated her body as if she was a deer he'd hunted. Further investigations found even more monstrosities in Ed Gein's House of Horrors, some of which were organs in jars, bone fragments, noses, lips, and fingernails, and various items fashioned all from human skin, including a wastebasket made from skin, armchair cushions, leggings from someone's legs, a mask from a woman's face, a lampshade from a face, and some skulls were being used as soup bowls. I obviously left a lot of other things out, but Wikipedia's got a pretty nice running list of all the nightmare fuel the investigators recovered from his home. After officials questioned Ed, he confessed to butchering Bernice, as well as another woman named Mary Hogan, who went missing 3 years earlier. He also confessed to digging up multiple corpses and taking their parts. So he could practice making masks and suits out of their skin to wear at home. If you guys didn't already know, Ed Gein was a big inspiration for Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. Along with exhuming corpses and fashioning his new clothing line, Ed was a straight-up necro you-know-what. Between 1947 and 1952, he made as many as 40 separate trips in the middle of the night to local graveyards to exhume recently buried bodies. He described being in a dazed-like state when he did it, and visited 3 separate cemeteries for his trophies. On about 30 of those visits, he said he came out of the dazed state and ended up leaving the grave empty-handed. On other occasions, he dug up the graves of recently buried middle-aged women who he thought looked like his mom. Rumor has it, he would take the bodies home and tan their skins to make his pieces. Ed eventually admitted to stealing from 9 graves at the local cemeteries, and even led the investigators to the locations. And get this, in order to prove that Ed Gein could have actually done it, the investigators went in and exhumed 3 different graves themselves. Ed was only 5'6" and weighed 130 pounds soaking wet, so they weren't so sure it was physically possible, especially because he would go several nights in a row. The caskets themselves were inside these wooden boxes that were buried 2 feet below the ground in sandy soil, and Ed said he'd robbed the graves soon after the funerals when the graves were not yet completed. Sure enough, when the investigators exhumed the graves, they found them to be exactly as Ed said they would. 2 of them were found empty, with one having a crowbar in place of the body. Most of the body was gone from the 3rd grave, but for some reason, Ed had returned rings and some body parts, which unfortunately confirmed he was telling the truth. Soon after his mother's death, Ed started to make his woman suit so that he could become his mother and literally crawl into her skin, because he loved and missed his mother that much. I really cherish my mother, but I have a picture of her hanging on my wall. Ed denied doing lewd acts with the bodies he exhumed and said that they smelled too bad. But psychologists still labeled him a necro because corpses and pieces of body parts still excited him. During the interrogation, Ed also admitted to butchering Mary Hogan, whose head they found in the house, but he said he couldn't remember any details of what happened. A 16-year-old kid who was friends with Ed told authorities that he kept shrunken heads in his house from the Philippines that were from his cousin who served there in World War II. Ed told him they were relics. But when the police investigated the heads, they discovered that these were actually the masks Gein had made himself from peeling the faces off of corpses. Ed was also considered a suspect in several other unsolved cases, including the disappearance of a babysitter in Wisconsin. Authorities attempted to connect him to other murders and disappearances from recent years, but they could never prove it. Ed's lawyer decided to enter a not guilty plea by reason of insanity, and Ed was found unfit to stand trial. He was sent to a state mental hospital where he worked as a carpenter's assistant and a medical center aide. 10 years after being committed to the institution, Ed was finally determined fit to stand trial. He was found guilty of the crimes against Barbara Warden and was yeeted right back to the state hospital. Ed became a fascinating person to study for psychologists, who, up until this point, thought men like Ed were the works of fiction. They were morbidly captivated by his terrifying hobbies and wanted to know why. And I would personally like to know, why, God? Ed had explained to psychologists that when he was a child, he often wondered what it would be like to be a woman, and it sounded like it became a fixation for him. He thought that by making his own epidermis onesie, he could feel what it would be like to be a woman. The Gein house and property was appraised, and his possessions were scheduled to be auctioned off. It was also rumored that the house and the land it stood on might become a tourist attraction, and all of us are probably descendants of the tourists who showed up to look at his property. But early one morning in 1958, the house was destroyed by fire. Arson was suspected, but the cause of the fire was never officially determined. When the institutionalized Ed found out about the fire, he just shrugged and said, just as well. Even though he only ever admitted to actually butchering 2 women, experts believe he was most likely responsible for many more, but we will never know for sure. He truly is the worst. Thanks for watching! When Deana Wild's mom gets a call saying that her daughter had fallen while rock climbing and didn't survive, she was absolutely heartbroken. When she tried to file a claim to receive the small but helpful life insurance policy she had taken out on her daughter, she kept running into issues. What Mrs. Wild thought would be a minor headache of some phone calls to make ended up taking her down a wild and harrowing chase to prove that her daughter's fall was no accident at all. One bright, windy day in April of 1987, 3 tourists were walking along the beautiful cliffs of Seal Beach in Big Sur, California. The group, who were all visiting from San Diego, consisted of the couple Billy Joe and Virginia McGinnis, and their friend and housemate Deana Wild. They'd stopped to have lunch at a nice spot, then decided to do some sightseeing at the cliffs, take some pictures, and head home for the day. Sometime that afternoon, a cashier at a nearby store is startled when Billy Joe, sometimes called BJ, and Virginia burst into the shop, screaming that their friend had fallen over the cliff's edge. Yikes! Rescue workers were immediately dispatched and found Deana's body at the bottom of the cliffs. But after plunging near 500 feet to the ground, Deana hadn't survived the fall. Suspicious? Not exactly. This unfortunately wasn't an uncommon occurrence that happened on the cliffs. Emergency dispatchers apparently receive a few of these types of calls a year, especially once the summer months hit and the weather warms up. Tourists who aren't familiar with the strong gusts of wind and loose gravel would sometimes try to get that perfect shot of that sparkling water, and would lean a little too far and lose their footing. So think twice next time before you do it for the gram. When the investigators asked the couple what happened, the couple said they were walking along the side of the cliffs with Deana after they decided to return to the car. Billy Joe and Virginia had turned around and said Deana wanted to look out at the view one last time, then would join them. In a matter of seconds, the couple turned around and Deana was gone. They rushed to the cliff's edge, only to see the 500-foot drop, so they ran for help. One of the worst parts about the case was that investigators found out that Deana had an intense fear of heights and that it was one of her biggest phobias. So it really was a tragic way for her to lose her life. If Deana was so afraid of heights, then why would she get so close to the edge in the first place? Well, Virginia and BJ were devastated. They told authorities that Deana was in the process of divorcing her husband, so she was staying and traveling with BJ and Virginia while attempting to get back on her feet. They also told the authorities they had taken her in because she had an intellectual disability, which made her vulnerable and bad at making decisions. Deana had also been wearing shoes that were high-heeled, which they guessed is what made her lose her footing. To back this up, the couple developed the photos they took with Deana just minutes before she went over the cliff. And the police see in the photos that Deana was teetering on some pretty high heels. An autopsy of Deana's body was performed, and the examiner deemed that Deana succumbed to a fracture on the back of her skull, which was consistent with someone who had taken a 500-foot fatal fall and landed on the rocky cliffs below. When Deana's mom told her friend at church weeks later that she was having trouble collecting Deana's burial insurance, her friend Steve, a successful corporate lawyer, agreed to help her out. Deana's mom, Bobby, also confided to Steve that she was having trouble accepting that her daughter's fall was an accident, and that her gut kept telling her that something felt wrong. And oh, Bobby, how right your instincts are. Deana officially hired Steve as her private investigator, and one of the first things that Steve notices is that no photographs had been taken of the crime scene. He was also extremely disappointed in the autopsy work of the coroner, who only did a routine autopsy as opposed to a more thorough investigation. This made it impossible to prove to the insurance companies or courts what the exact COD was. But when Steve scoured over the photographs of Deana and the McGinnises that day, the photos told an entirely different story from what the couple said went down. In the photos taken at the beginning of the day, Deana is seen posing and smiling in front of the cliffs. But in the photographs taken a few hours later, Deana's appearance has drastically changed. She appears exhausted, sleepy, and is leaning against BJ in a lot of the photos, almost like slumped onto him. Her eyes are half open, and she's no longer smiling, but staring blankly into the lens of the camera. One photo in the series after the sleepy ones showed BJ and Deana with their backs to the camera, staring over the edge of the cliff, and he's looking over his shoulder to the right towards the main road. You know, like a frickin' Scooby-Doo villain. Immediately, Steve was suspicious of the photos, and he believed BJ was looking behind him to check if the coast was clear and that no cars were passing by. Steve was certain that he was looking at the last known moments of Deana alive, along with the person who pushed her. He just had to prove it. The last 4 pictures after the "Is the coast clear" photo made Steve even more sus. The photos have no one in them and are taken from a few angles over the cliff. The first photo is looking down the cliff, showing the area where Deana fell. The next 2 photos are a panoramic view of the cliffs, and the final photo is a shot of the road directly behind them. Well, what do we have here? Steve believed that this was Virginia surveilling the scene through the viewfinder in the camera to make sure no one had seen what they did. I guess thank goodness that Virginia's pea-brain wasn't advanced enough for her to throw away these photos, because instead, she stupidly gave them to the police. This accidental fall was beginning to seem not so accidental. And thanks to Steve, the authorities began investigating to try to figure out if there was any motive for BJ to push Deana off the cliff. And what do you know? As if Billy and Virginia wanted to solve the case for them, the detectives discovered they had taken out a $35,000 life insurance policy on Deana only one day before her fall. So the detectives went to the insurance agent that the couple went to and spoke with the man who told them that Virginia asked him a question on the way out the door that stuck out to him. She asked if the life insurance policy was still applicable if the fatality was an accident. And the agent was like, yes. One day after Deana's fall, and 2 days after setting up the life insurance policy, Virginia filed to collect the insurance and showed back up to the agent, who was like, no freaking way. The name listed as the beneficiary on the policy was their son, James Coates, who was currently serving time in prison. He had been listed as Deana's fiance, even though he and Deana were currently married to other people. The insurance agent didn't want to suspect the worst, and said it has happened before where people have the unfortunate luck of taking out a life insurance policy only for the person to pass the next day. To quote Steve on what he thought of this coincidence, "It's not proof, but it sure stinks." Now the authorities had reason to believe they were no longer looking at an accident, but a well-executed scheme. They just had to prove it. But how do you prove this theory with not a whole lot of evidence? Deana's autopsy is regularly commented on by investigators as barely meeting the standards, and bashed by Steve as shoddy work due to the fact that the person performing the autopsy was not a forensic pathologist, meaning they weren't looking for signs of foul play. But the examiner did something during that autopsy that is virtually unheard of as far as autopsies go back in those days, that would end up sealing the fate in Deana's case. He took a vial of Deana's vital fluid. Oh snap. For reasons unclear, the examiner kept the vial, and there it sat in refrigerated storage for 2 years until it would be taken out for re-examination. The sample was sent to be tested for traces of any substances in Deana's system that would have made her appear the way she did in those photographs. When the sample comes back from the lab, they find traces of a medication commonly used to treat depression called Elavil. For someone who had never taken an antidepressant in their life, a medication like Elavil would have made Deana quite drowsy, according to forensic pathologists. So they now had reason to suspect that Deana was slipped a pill unknowingly. And did Deana know anyone who took Elavil for their depression? Of course she did. Her faux father-in-law, BJ. The investigators speculated that BJ must have slipped Deana his Elavil at some point during the lunch they'd eaten at the diner 2 hours before. The waitress at the diner said Deana ordered a soft drink, and that's what detectives believe BJ used to dissolve the pill in. But they had no way of proving this, so they turned in another direction for proof: the photos of Deana's autopsy. A forensic pathologist examined the photos and noticed 2 jarring details, which had barely been mentioned in the original autopsy report. The first was the fact that Deana had wounds on the back of her hands, but not on her palms, and her fingernails were all broken. The broken fingernails indicated that Deana hadn't just fallen, but she'd fallen and managed to hang on by her fingertips before she actually went down. But what didn't make sense about this was that she didn't have any scrapes on her palms, only deep wounds and bruises on the back of her hands. She couldn't prove it, but the pathologist had a theory. She believed that Deana was originally pushed, but she'd managed to hang on and catch herself on the edge, which explains the damage to her nails and fingertips. She then assumed that BJ either stomped on her hands or used a sharp object to strike the back of her hands until she was forced to let go. And as awful as that discovery was, they now had proof that Deana had been attacked, as opposed to the theory that she accidentally fell. But charging the couple in a crime this extreme was going to be a huge accusation that they needed to be ready to prove with absolute certainty. The detectives decided to look into Virginia first and ran a background check. And they found some very interesting skeletons in Virginia's closet. First, they saw that Virginia collected on a life insurance policy in 1972 when her 3-year-old daughter suffocated in a horrendous accident. Hold up, her own daughter? Then in 1974, Virginia's former husband, Sylvester, passed under mysterious circumstances. And once again, Ginny collected her pretty penny. In 1986, Virginia's next victim was her own freaking mother, who suffered a heart attack under mysterious circumstances, and she collected insurance money yet again. Oh yeah, and did I mention that every house she lived in burned to the ground? Yep, she of course collected insurance on all those fires as well. The best part about our resident evil genius? Every one of her life insurance policies was made for the exact same amount. $35,000. Because the amount of the settlement was so low, no insurance companies would think to question it, which is how she was able to slither away with policy after policy every time. This particular insurance policy was especially damaging because the entire thing was forged. She faked the witness signature of her neighbor and even spelled the lady's name wrong. They forced Virginia to submit a handwriting sample and proved that she had forged the document. 2 years after Deana's fatal fall, Billy Joe and Virginia McGinnis were arrested and charged with taking the life of Deana for their own financial gain. BJ never made it to trial and passed away while sitting in jail. When Virginia finally took the stand, she tried to claim all of a sudden that she was no longer there at the scene of the crime and said she wasn't in any of the pictures, only BJ. But prosecutors pointed out that the shadow of the photographer was clearly visible, and they knew the position of the sun in the sky thanks to the time of the 911 call. And because they were the real geniuses here, they used the mother effing Pythagorean theorem to prove the height of the shadow was the exact height of Virginia McGinnis, 5'6". So math teachers, feel free to use this story when your students try to argue with you that they'll never use the Pythagorean theorem in real life. The prosecution argued that Virginia saw the vulnerable Deana in the middle of a divorce and jumped at her chance. She was a skilled con artist and knew an easy target when she saw one. Poor Deana didn't stand a chance against this Black Widow. After 4 days of deliberating, the jury ruled that Virginia was guilty in the first degree, so she was sentenced to life in prison. In 2011, Virginia McGinnis passed away at the ripe old age of 74 and has still never officially been brought to justice for her suspected 3 other victims. And that is the story of how broken fingernails, some sketchy photos, the Pythagorean theorem, and a lawyer who wouldn't give up solved the case of Deana Wild and put a Black Widow behind bars. And it looks like our stuffed mushrooms are just about done. You know whose mushrooms I'd like to stuff? Oh, sorry, I guess we're out of time. Bye!
When a 19-year-old woman appeared out of thin air after claiming to have just escaped from a brutal attack, the police were ready to go all in. But as they tried to get to the bottom of what happened, the twisting tale this woman tells is kind of like something you'd hear in a soap opera, or at least some sort of edgy queer teen Netflix drama. Hang on to your veggies, folks, because things are about to get real dicey. On the night of March 22nd, 2018, somewhere in rural Wisconsin, 90-year-old Don Sipple had just sat down to have some dinner when he heard a distressed knocking sound come from his front door. Dawn opened up the door to see a young woman in torn, stained clothes, and through her tears, she claimed that someone had just attacked her. Unsure of what happened, Dawn called 911 and told them that there was a young woman at his house who had been attacked and needed a doctor. He told the operators that the woman was wearing clothing that was covered in mud and other stains and appeared as if she walked to Dawn's house barefoot. So who the hell was this woman, and how had she gotten to Dawn's tiny farmhouse in the middle of nowhere? The 911 operator asked what the woman's name was, but the girl just sobbed harder and said she didn't know. On the call, which you can listen to online, you can hear this woman hysterically crying in the background and Don saying she's in pretty bad shape and they need to send someone down there real quick. Anyway, the officers had Dawn ask the woman if she had known who did this to her, but she was too distraught to answer and could barely get a word out, so he stopped pressing her and just stayed on the phone until help arrived. Once the cops got there, they took the woman into the back of their car and began to ask her questions, but her answers weren't very helpful and she couldn't stop crying hysterically. This girl was in bad shape. And the recordings and interviews of her, it's clear that whatever had happened was extremely traumatic because her thoughts and answers were completely scattered. And when she was talking, and she also wasn't giving the investigators anything helpful to go off of. Like when they asked her what hurts, she just responded with everything. And then they asked her who she was with or who did this to her, and she responded with, I don't know. At this point, they still had no idea who this girl was. She didn't have any wallet or ID with her, and the only thing she told them is that she's from Eau Claire, Wisconsin, but didn't know her address or how long she lived there. Is this starting to smell a bit fishy to anyone? I'm no expert, but as an avid true crime consumer, the fact that the woman won't give away her name or address raises some red flags for me. The only information that the cops are able to get from her is the name of the friend that they could call, Jason Mengel. And the doctors are like, well, who the heck is that? They put a pin in it and took the girl to the hospital so they could get her checked out and stabilized. As the doctors began to treat her cuts, they noticed something strange. The woman had the word boy carved into her left forearm, but that wasn't the only thing that struck them as odd. They noticed that the cuts and scratches on the woman's body were all superficial. Sure, she looked worse for wear, but not enough for her to need excessive medical treatment. And despite the fact that she said she was in an immense amount of pain, they couldn't really do much besides bandage her up. In the hospital, the woman calmed down enough to finally be able to tell them her name, Monica Carlin. Monica told the investigators that her attacker was the one who cut the word into her arm. And at this point, the detectives had even more questions than answers. So they decided to look into Monica Carlin, or at least try to, because the first thing they found out was that Monica Carlin was no longer the woman's legal name, and that she actually changed it twice. Before she was Monica Carlin, she was Monica J. And actually, she wasn't even Monica Carlin anymore. She recently changed her name from Monica Carlin to Ezra McCandless. When the newly bandaged Ezra McCandless walked into the room for questioning, she was finally ready to tell her side of the story, or part of it, I should say, because she still seemed to be suffering from that post-attack amnesia. By this point, the police had also gotten reports of a 24-year-old guy named Alex Woodworth who'd gone missing in that area, and it seemed the pieces were starting to emerge from an ever-growing puzzle. There was an alleged victim of an attack. Ezra's car was nowhere to be found, and there was a missing guy named Alex. And then officials found out that Alex was Ezra's ongoing, off-again, on-again boyfriend that was last seen with Ezra on the day he went missing. Yes. Those on-again, off-again relationships you always hear about that just make you go, that sounds like, I don't know, healthy? Even healthier, the police had actually been called to check on a domestic disturbance just a few hours earlier at Alex's house that very same day when Ezra had been over. Yet, of course, Ezra maintained that she still had no recollection of the night before and didn't know where Alex or her car was. Throughout questioning, Ezra said her memory blacked out whenever she tried to remember that night, and initially in the investigation, the officers assumed, since her car was missing, that Alex attacked her and then just drove off with her car. But they were about to find out that this case was not going to be that simple. And boy, were their cabbage heads about to roll. Because Ezra wouldn't give them any help as to what happened the hours before she showed up to Dawn Sipple's doorstep. They decided to push in a different direction and asked about the first person's name she said on March 22nd, after she claimed she'd been attacked by Jason Mengel. Remember this guy? Just roll with me. It's all coming together in a second. Let's grab some coffee. Racy's Coffee Shop was this hipster, Instagram-worthy coffee shop that was always popping with the local teens and university students. Ezra, being a free-spirited artist who wanted to meet more intellectual minds, was often found seated in one of the overstuffed vintage armchairs. You can see it in your head, can't you? Every town has their version of Racy's. Racy is also where she met her now ex-boyfriend, Jason Mengel. So Jason Mengel was this very interesting character. He was a medic in the army. He liked to wear those flat newsboy caps and apparently rode his bike everywhere he went. Total hipster. Like, let me shadow that for you real quick, because Jason was 33 years old. In August of 2017, Jason and Ezra started officially dating when Ezra was only 19. I don't care if it's technically legal, it still gives me shivers. Like, 14-year age gap? Yeesh. Jason swore he initially didn't know how big the age gap was and said she spoke like she was much older than she actually was. And as the detectives interviewed Jason, they got to know Ezra a little bit better. Ezra McCandless was a person who really struggled with her identity growing up. She told the investigators she questioned her gender at times, and as well as her sexual identity, and often felt like she didn't fit in with any group. She said in high school she dressed more masculine and described her gender as fluid, but that nowadays she embraced her feminine side and used she/her pronouns. This theme of identity crisis would continue throughout her life when Monica Carlin decided to change her name to Ezra McCandless, before she was even a legal adult. Why this name? She explained Ezra because she wanted a more androgynous unisex sounding name, and McCandless after Christopher McCandless. Yes, the Into the Wild abandoned everything to live in Alaskan wilderness and eventually die guy. Ezra and Jason had moved in together after a few months of dating, but they'd hit a rough patch in their relationship around 2017. And around that time, Ezra met Alex Woodworth. Alex was this 20-something-year-old guy who she'd seen at her local bar, often hunched over, scribbled in a notebook. So one night, Ezra decided to approach him and strike up a conversation, and thus began their secret and complicated relationship. Alex was in the process of getting his PhD in philosophy and worked as a barista at Racy's to pay for school, because that's what it takes if you want a higher education these days. According to Ezra, Alex was a troubled soul and carried around notebooks of his journaled thoughts on life and darker things. Just like Ezra, Alex was someone who struggled with his sexual identity as well as depression, which he told Jason about whenever he had a little too much at the bar. Yeah, you heard that right. Alex and Jason were friends, while Ezra was secretly dating Alex behind Jason's back. All three of them actually were really close friends. Eventually the secret got out and Jason broke up with Ezra, which resulted in Ezra breaking up with Alex or something of that sort. But apparently all three remained friends. Different people claimed different things. Different sources said different things, but essentially everyone was single in the end. Like I said earlier, we are dealing with a lot of healthy relationships here. So let's fast forward to the morning of March 22nd when Ezra said she had returned some items to both of her exes that day and picked up some of her things from them. Here's the general timeline of what investigators think happened on that night. First, Ezra went to Racy's and exchanged stuff with Jason. Then she told him she was going to Alex's place next. Ezra drove to Alex's house and parked in his driveway. She left the car running because she thought that it wouldn't take that long. Alex asked her upstairs to talk, so the two went upstairs. Meanwhile, Jason said he had a bad gut feeling, so he decided to ride by Alex's place to make sure that everything was okay. Jason saw that Ezra's car was parked in the driveway, still running, and was like, oh shit. During all of this, someone nearby got suspicious of the idling car and the man, Jason, who had been pacing across the street, and they called the cops. Just before Jason could pedal on his merry way, he was stopped in his tracks by some officers responding to a domestic disturbance call. When the three were told neighbors had heard raised voices, they acted confused and said they had no idea what they were talking about, and there hadn't been a disturbance. Ezra said her and Alex decided to take a drive, and then everything went fuzzy. As soon as Ezra said this, the cops immediately perked up. By this point in the investigation, Ezra had been in and out of hospitals and holding cells, and she had no idea that the lifeless body of Alex Woodworth had been discovered hanging halfway out of the back of her abandoned car. Afraid she would clam up again, the police strategically began to press Ezra for more and more details about the car ride. But of course the amnesia came back, and she could only say she remembered she felt really scared, and then showed up at Dawn's house. Does anyone else find it convenient how every time we might potentially hear some incriminating evidence, suddenly Ezra can't remember anything? Now, eventually they asked her if Alex attacked her. She told them yes, and she said she was afraid for her life. They asked who carved the word boy into her arm, and she told them that Alex did. Officials were still super confused, so Ezra explained to them her history with her gender identity and how she used to identify as male in high school. She claimed Alex wanted her to be a boy in their relationship and would sometimes refer to her as such. The cops had been suspicious that Ezra had not told the full truth during the investigation, and now they knew that they'd finally caught her in a lie. Based on the placement of the word on her arm and that it was facing towards her, they knew she was the only one who could have carved the word at that angle into her arm. So the cops were like, oh, really? He carved it upside down in your arm while he was driving the car? And you can literally see Ezra implode on herself as she realized what she had just done. The investigators knew it was showtime, baby, and it was time to go all out. They tell her they walked down the road from Don Sippel's house until they found a set of footprints leading to her car. And they're like, well, what happened, Ezra? Suddenly, the fog lifted and Ezra could remember what happened. Ezra said that Alex got mad all of a sudden and threw her in the back of the car and just started grabbing and attacking her. She said he cut her clothes with a blade, so she said she got the blade from him and started defending herself as fast as she could. Despite this statement, Alex's wounds were found to be far worse than Ezra's. Autopsy reports showed that the blade pierced Alex 16 times, and he was found to have cuts on his brain, lung, amongst other areas. Because Alex couldn't tell his side of the story, the experts had to look at the forensic evidence to try to piece together a more accurate picture of actually what happened. Experts described the attack on Alex as an act of pure rage as opposed to self-defense, and they had a theory that it was premeditated by Ezra, who blamed Alex for the end of their relationship with Jason. But was Ezra this cold, calculated villain who acted out of pure rage? Or was she really the defenseless victim of a random attack of a young, troubled man? In court, Ezra changed her story to say that Alex's attack was sexually motivated, but by the sheer brutality of the puncture marks shown in the forensic pathologist's testimony to the jury, it was clear that this was not a matter of self-defense but an act of anger. The jury also heard that Alex's cell phone and the weapon had been dropped and later found along the highway as Ezra's way of trying to dispose of evidence, as well as the fact that Ezra's wounds were self-inflicted, including the word boy on her arm, which she admitted she had done herself when they caught her in the lie of it facing the wrong way. Yeah, this girl was really starting to not look good up there. Ezra initially tried to plead not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, but later pleaded not guilty. During her trial, her jury did not find her to be believable or even likable for that matter. When the judge sentenced her, he told her he never saw the slight bit of remorse for what she had done or for Alex. The jury believes she planned it from the very start, and Ezra McCandless was found guilty in the first degree, and on February 7, 2020, she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 50 years. She currently sits in a correctional facility in Wisconsin, and like a lot of other inmates we've covered, she also sells her art on Instagram pages to raise funds for her appeals. Obviously, I always want to believe the victim in this case, but what do you do when the attacker also claims to be the victim? As far as I'm concerned, everyone was a victim in this case and no one came out on top. Well, maybe we did, since we've got these delicious cabbage rolls to dig into. Thank you so much for watching, and we really appreciate it.
Who was known for sneaking into people's houses at night, slaying them, writing pentagrams in their lipstick, and leaving behind shoe prints from ugly sneakers? Richard Ramirez. Well, most people know him as the Night Stalker. This dude was a mass executioner and robber who whacked out at least 13 people in California between 1984 and 1985. That's 13 people in 1 year, and all of them were extremely gory and disturbing. But apparently they never made Richard lose his appetite because he would apparently raid his victims' pantries for snacks after slaying them. Richard grew up in El Paso, Texas, with 4 older siblings, and I wish I could say he had a happy childhood, but then I'd be lying. It was pretty rough. His dad was a former police officer from Mexico who was known for having anger outbursts that would often lead to abuse towards the whole family. When he was really little, Richard suffered from serious head injuries. At age 10, he started smoking weed with his cousin Miguel. Miguel was a Vietnam War vet and would tell Richard tons of gruesome war stories when they were lighting it up. When Richard was 12, Miguel showed him a bunch of super graphic pictures of women he had tortured and terminated in Vietnam. How was his cousin casually showing these pictures to Richard as a kid? And why does he even have pictures of them in the first place? That is so sickening. Usually my cousins and I just have slumber parties, normal stuff. But those awful pictures weren't the only thing Miguel showed Richard. He started showing him skills that he learned in the military, including how to execute someone. Okay, this is getting out of hand. In what world is any of this okay? And around that same time, Richard witnessed his cousin Miguel terminate his wife with bullets. OMG, I knew Mike was no good. And how freaking terrible is it that he did all of that while Richard was watching? Well, after Richard saw the whole thing go down, he became super moody and distanced himself from his friends and family. He ended up moving in with his older sister and her peeping Tom of a husband named Roberto. Roberto would literally take Richard with him out at night to look through the windows of their neighbors' houses, most of which were attractive young females. What a creep. I wonder what Robert's wife thought about all of this, or if she even knew. At this point, Richard had also gotten into LSD and expressed an interest in Satanism. This story just keeps getting worse by the minute. Miguel went with the insanity plea and was found not guilty for icing out his wife. He was released after serving 4 years at a mental hospital, which meant he was back in Richard's life. Amazing! That's sarcasm, obviously. As a teen, Richard got a job at a nearby Holiday Inn where he apparently used his key to rob guests while they were sleeping or out of their rooms. So Richard dropped out of high school when he was 15, but no one really knows what he was up to until he moved to California at age 22. When Richard got to California, he picked back up with his savagery. He broke into multiple people's homes, continued attacking women, and served in jail for a hot second for stealing a car. In April of 1984, Richard's first known execution went down. He somehow got a 9-year-old little girl down in the basement of the hotel he had been staying at in San Francisco. He sexually assaulted and beat the girl before jabbing her with a blade until she took her last breath. After the terrible hotel basement thing, Richard moved to Los Angeles, where the slayings continued. In June of 1984, Richard broke in and went after a 79-year-old woman while she was asleep in her bed. He slashed her multiple times with the blade, and the cuts were so bad on her throat she was almost completely decapitated. Richard got in through the window and left a fingerprint behind. But at the time, no one knew who the perp was or what he was capable of. He was never actually charged for this crime, but there are plenty more gruesome attacks to come that he would be charged for. Less than 2 months later, Richard went after his next victims. He broke into another couple's house and fired at the husband, Bill, who grabbed for his own Glock. But before Bill could do anything, Richard beat him up. After that, Richard went after Bill's wife, who was disabled. We don't need to go over every single one, but just know they were all awful and pretty much happened the same way as his others. Breaking into a home at night, assaulting the people inside, using weapons against them, stealing their valuables, mentioning something about the devil, and fleeing the scene. He reportedly attacked 18 different times, injuring at least 17 people and slaying at least 13. During his third to last attack, which took place in San Francisco in August of 1985, Richard drew a pentagram and wrote the phrase, "Jack the Knife," in lipstick on the wall. He also ate everything in their fridge. And after his post-slaying snack, Richard left the house. But what he didn't know is he left behind a shoe print that belonged to the same size, 11.5, Avia sneakers that were found at some of the other crime scenes. This time, detectives got smart and were able to figure out the make of the shoes. Apparently only 6 pairs were made in size 11.5, so they did some digging. 5 of them were shipped to Arizona, so they knew the 6th pair was Richard's. So during his last attack, which happened in August of 1985, Richard broke into a couple's house while they were catching Z's, per the usual. He assaulted the woman, stole her cash and bling, and forced her to swear on Satan. Before he left, Richard said, "Tell them the Night Stalker was here." Ooh, I I feel like now he's like making it a game with the police and press. He's definitely hyping himself up right there. So the woman ran over to her neighbor's house for help, and her husband was rushed to the hospital. The bullets were removed and he survived. The woman described Richard to officials who were able to track down the stolen car he had been driving. It was abandoned and wiped clean except for one fingerprint on the rear view mirror. Police pulled the print, ran it through their system, and found a match. It was Richard Ramirez. A ton of media outlets then dropped Richard's mugshot and description, pinning him as the Night Stalker. The police held a press conference where they said, "We know who you are now, and soon everyone else will. There will be no place you can hide." Oh snap! One day after Richard's mugshot was released to the public, he took a bus to Tucson, Arizona to visit his brother. Well, apparently his brother didn't know about Richard's reputation in California, and it's never really clear why, but they didn't meet up. I'm gonna go out there and guess that the brother may have found out about the whole Night Stalker thing while Richard was on his way and decided to stand him up. Anyway, Richard took a bus back to LA, and the next morning when he got off the bus, he walked past a newsstand and saw his face on the cover of just about every newspaper and magazine. At this point, he started going ballistic. He ran away from the newsstand and ended up on a freeway where he tried stealing 3 people's cars, but Richard was unsuccessful. He kept running, hopped a bunch of fences, and was eventually stopped by a group of guys who started beating him up. The group of men kept punching and hitting Richard until the cops arrived. One of the guys even hit him over the head with a metal bar. At his first court appearance, Richard drew a pentagram on his hand. When he took the stand, he held his hand up and said, "Hail Satan." What is this guy's problem? When he was in jail awaiting his sentencing, Richard apparently told some of the guards that he was going to execute the prosecutor with a bullet. They freaked out and obviously notified officials, who made sure there was a metal detector outside. On the day of his trial, one of the jurors didn't show up. She apparently was slain with a bullet that day. People panicked because they thought Richard somehow did it, even though he was supposedly in a jail cell the whole time. I guess they thought he could have hired someone or something. Well, the woman was apparently iced by her boyfriend, but it's still such a freaky situation. How wild! Like, what are the odds all of that happens? I guess Richard has a knack for dramatic scenes, so I should have seen it coming. Also, does that mean they didn't have metal detectors in court before Richard's trial? That would be insane if that were the case. On September 20th, 1989, Richard was convicted for 13 slayings, 5 attempted slayings, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. OMG! I can't believe how much this man got away with. Richard was sentenced to be executed in a gas chamber. After his sentencing, he told reporters, "Big deal. Death always won with the territory. See you in Disneyland." Richard tried to appeal his execution sentence, so it was on hold until everything was sorted out. But before that happened, Richard was diagnosed with cancer and passed away in 2013. Oh, and I forgot to mention this earlier, but during some of his attacks, Richard was apparently staying at the Cecil Hotel, which is a super creepy hotel that is home for many slayings and mysterious passings. Well, that's all for now. Make sure you sleep with one eye open tonight, because there could be another Valley intruder on the loose. No, that does not have the same ring to it. Let me try that again. There could be another Night Stalker on the loose. And remember, be blueberry safe out there. Hello, and welcome to Killer Bites, a show where we talk all things crime while making a delicious recipe. Crime and food seem like a strange pairing, but think of it as a perfect combination of salty and sweet. Today on Killer Bites, I'm going to tell you about Agatha Christie's bizarre disappearance while making a chicken and waffle breakfast sandwich. If you find yourself craving the same thing, the recipe is in the description below. Months after the famous crime novelist Agatha Christie finished her book titled The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, she vanished. The circumstances of her disappearance were very peculiar. Thousands of people searched for her, some performed seances, and one man even hired a psychic to help track down Agatha. But 11 days later, she resurfaced with no recollection of what happened or who she was. What the heck happened? On the night of December 3rd, 1926, 36-year-old Agatha Christie kissed her daughter goodnight and wrote a letter for her secretary saying she wouldn't be coming back home that night. Then she walked out of her Sunningdale, England home with just a briefcase in hand and drove off in her Morris Crowley. At 8 a.m. the following morning, Agatha's car was found crashed and abandoned on the edge of a chalk pit several miles away from her home. It was positioned in between some bushes with the headlights still on. The wheels were literally hanging over a cliff, and her briefcase was still inside. At first, it seemed like Agatha could have just gotten in a crash, but she was nowhere to be found. You'd think she'd still be in the car or immediately find help or something. The whole setup was very peculiar, and there were no clues that suggested where Agatha went. Did she run away? Was she abducted? It was all a mystery. So I'm going to start by putting my vegan chicken cutlets in the oven. A huge search for Agatha began, and over the next couple of days, the story of Agatha's disappearance started to circulate far and wide. It was even published on the cover of the New York Times on December 6th. As I mentioned earlier, Agatha was an extremely famous crime novelist. How crazy is it that someone who writes about crimes goes missing in a very crime-like way? You know what they say, life imitates art. While investigators were searching for evidence and interviewing Agatha's friends and family, civilians and other crime novelists were coming up with theories of their own. Some people believed Agatha was snuffed by her husband. Others thought she accidentally or intentionally drowned in the nearby pond. And a handful of people thought this was a publicity stunt to build clout for her newest book. OMG, that would be super extra, but you gotta do what you gotta do. The search for Agatha was massive. Thousands of police officers and concerned volunteers spent hours upon hours looking for her. And on December 8th, there was a break in the case. Agatha's brother-in-law received a letter in the mail from her saying she was going to a Yorkshire spa for rest and treatment. Please don't tell me this girl took an impromptu vacay and made the whole world think something terrible happened to her. So now I'm gonna mix my waffle mix and water. Once the authorities were informed of the note, they called off the investigation. But when 2 days passed and people still hadn't heard a peep from Agatha, the investigation was started right back up again. Police officers took Agatha's dog over by where her car was found to see if it would be able to track her scent. It was worth a shot, but the dog ended up just whining and proved to be no help at all. Wait, I love how the detectives just took her dog out to the scene thinking it would be this pro search dog. Don't they have a special canine unit for that? At this point, investigators were desperate to find Agatha, that they entertained whatever lead or theory they caught a whiff of. So when the theory about Agatha purposefully sinking to the bottom of the pond started to spread, officials decided to dredge the Silent Pool, which was a natural pond in the area. According to local legend, the Silent Pool was bottomless, but when the authorities dredged the pond, Agatha wasn't there. And I guess the myth was busted that the Silent Pool was bottomless too? Another belief was that Agatha's house was haunted, and that had something to do with her vanishing. Apparently, Agatha once told her friend, "If I do not leave Sunningdale soon, Sunningdale will be the end of me." But how would that explain her driving off and disappearing? Ooh, maybe a ghost is involved. When it was about a week into the investigation and officials were still unable to track down any witnesses, they started to lose hope. The only real clues they had to go off of were 3 letters from Agatha. The one she left her secretary, the one she left her brother-in-law, and one she sent her husband. But her husband wouldn't say what Agatha wrote to him. He just said it was a personal note. So Agatha's marriage was a hot mess as of late because her husband had been cheating on her, which led a lot of people to believe he had something to do with her going missing. Agatha first met Archibald, or Archie Christie, at a local dance in 1912. At the time, she was 22 years old. In 1914, Archie was sent to France for World War I, but he returned later that year and married Agatha. They bounced around the London area for several years until settling down in Sunningdale and having a daughter, Rosalind, who was named after the heroine from Shakespeare's As You Like It. Somewhere along the way, Agatha and Archie started experiencing issues in their marriage. Supposedly, money was one of the common points of tension. Classic. Well, Archie decided that instead of facing his marital problems face on, he would start hooking up with his 25-year-old secretary, Nancy Neal. Archie later decided that he wanted to divorce Agatha. He told her right around the time her mother passed away from bronchitis, so the timing wasn't ideal. Before Agatha drove off the last night she was seen, she and Archie apparently got in a big blow-up fight that ended in him packing some of his things for a weekend away with his friends and secretary turned mistress. I guess I should have led with that information, huh? Nah, I gotta keep you on your toes. And this was also the same order investigators started discovering all of this. Obviously, Archie and Nancy seemed super suspicious at this point, but like most of the search thus far, there were no witnesses, leads, or evidence. Detectives couldn't really entertain the theory that the cheating husband or mistress was responsible without more information. On December 13th, a huge group of 10,000 to 15,000 people joined in another hunt for Agatha. This time, cops brought 6 trained bloodhounds instead of Agatha's household dog. That same day, the police suspected Agatha was somewhere in London, disguised and probably in male attire. Not sure what spurred this theory, but there had to be something if the cops said this. Meanwhile, spiritualists were holding a seance at the chalk pit where Agatha's car was found. And Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, aka the mystery writer who created Sherlock Holmes, hired a psychic to try and find Agatha using her glove as a guide. The following day, it was reported in the newspaper that detectives found the following items near the pit: a bottle labeled poison lead and opium, torn up postcard pieces, a woman's coat, face powder, 2 children's books, a cardboard box, and the end of a bread loaf. How's that for a random combination of items? As the search continued, it really started to seem like Agatha was deceased. One newspaper even reported the police have information which they refuse to divulge, and which leads them to the view that Mrs. Christie had no intention of returning when she left home. But just one day after that was published, Agatha was found alive and healthy. Say what? The head waiter at the Hydropathic Hotel in Harrogate, Yorkshire, reached out to the police saying there was a super outgoing guest who went by the name Teresa Neal and spoke in a South African accent. This waiter suspected Teresa was actually Agatha in disguise. It's not clear what the reasoning was behind this theory, but it was super sketchy that Teresa had the same last name as Archie's mistress, Nancy Neal. After being tipped off by the waiter, a set of investigators went to the hotel with Archie to see if this woman really was Agatha. They sat down in the dining room and waited for a bit before Teresa walked in. It was definitely Agatha. She sat down at another table and began reading a newspaper that had the story of her own disappearance on the front cover. That's kind of weird. Maybe she just liked the attention? Well, Archie went up to his wife, and she apparently just gave him this blank stare and didn't recognize him at all. Agatha was completely convinced she was Teresa Neal. She had no idea her real identity was Agatha Christie, had no recollection of anything, and couldn't tell the difference between reality and imagination. Archie tried to get Agatha to come home with him, but reports say she was in no hurry to leave. She finally agreed to go with Archie, but decided to change into an evening gown for whatever reason. Nosy people and wannabe detectives swarmed the train station to see the resolution to the insane mystery as Agatha and Archie headed home. But even though the disappearance was solved, there were many questions that puzzled people everywhere. What the heck happened? Why did Agatha leave in the first place? How did the car crash happen? What were the letters all about? And why did she disguise herself? Archie told reporters, "The doctors told me such an action was compatible with that of a person suffering from loss of memory. She does not know who she is. She has suffered from the most complete loss of memory." The only time Agatha ever spoke about the incident was in an interview she did with the Daily Mail. As she was driving past the quarry one day, she said, "There came into my mind the thought of driving into it. However, as my daughter was with me in the car, I dismissed the idea at once. That night, I felt terribly miserable. I felt that I could go on no longer. I left home that night in a state of high nervous strain with the intention of doing something desperate. When I reached a point on the road which I thought was near the quarry, I turned the car off the road down the hill toward it. I left the wheel and let the car run. The car struck something with a jerk and pulled up suddenly. I was flung against the steering wheel and my head hit something. Up to this moment, I was Mrs. Christie." That's all Agatha would ever say. She claimed to have suffered from amnesia and didn't recall checking into the hotel. She wouldn't even talk about the situation with her friends. It was one of those things not on the table for discussion. Kind of like my ex-boyfriend at holiday gatherings. I feel you, Aggie girl. In March of 1928, which was a little over a year from the incident, Agatha sued Archie for divorce. 1 month later, the divorce was finalized. Agatha was in a really bad headspace after her mother's passing, divorce from Archie, and probably all of the people pestering her about her disappearance, so she traveled out of the country to heal. She went to Iraq, where she met an archaeologist named Max. They hit it off, and in 1930 got married in Edinburgh. Aw, good for her. She deserves it. Archie got married to Nancy too, but he sealed the deal before his and Agatha's divorce was even finalized. Jerkwad. Aside from one interview in 1928, Agatha never spoke of her disappearance ever again. She continued to write books and plays as her popularity soared through the roof. Agatha earned and still holds the title of the best-selling novelist of all time. She also got super into surfing and is recognized as the first woman to bring worldwide attention to the sport. On January 12, 1976, Agatha took her last breath. She was 85 years old. 1 year later, her autobiography was published. In her writings, Agatha never addressed the 11-day period where she vanished off the face of the earth and thousands of people searched for her. She barely even touched on her marriage with Archie. All Agatha wrote about that was, "There's no need to dwell on it." But even though Agatha never spilled the tea on what happened back in 1926, many psychologists, writers, and crime junkies ideated theories of their own. The most popular theory is that Agatha suffered a medical condition known as fugue state, or a period of out-of-body amnesia induced by stress. You know, I think I might have that. I'm always stressed and confused. A biographer and former doctor named Andrew Norman published a study on Agatha Christie's life using medical case studies to back up this theory. He elaborated that Agatha was in a psychogenic trance brought on by trauma or depression, and Agatha had plenty of that going on in her life. Andrew even expressed his opinion that Agatha had dark thoughts about ending her life. He proved this idea by saying, her state of mind was very low, and she writes about it later through the character of Celia in her autobiographical novel, Unfinished Portrait. Some people believed Agatha's mother's demise was the catalyst of the incident. Others believe it was Archie bringing up the divorce. As for me, I think it's a combination of the two. Andrew concluded Agatha's lack of memory and her made-up Teresa character were all a part of this amnesia. Alright, now I'm gonna assemble my chicken and waffle sandwich. But another theory claimed the disappearance was thought up by Agatha to punish her cheating husband. The primary reasoning behind this theory is the last name Agatha chose to check in at the hotel under. Yeah, I have a hard time believing that was a coincidence. The last main theory, built on Andrew's opinion, was that Agatha was contemplative of her life. Maybe she tried to end her life that day, but got scared when she drove up to the edge of the chalk pit. But then why would she go undercover? Did she change her mind and plan to live under a new identity entirely? One of the most ironic parts about all of this is that Agatha's crime novels always came to a resolution. No matter how insane the plot was, Agatha would always bring it to a satisfying resolution, and no questions went unanswered. The editor-in-chief of Vanity Fair remarked Agatha was great at capturing something elemental about mysteries. That motive and opportunity may suffice for a crime, but the satisfying part is the detective's revelation of who done it, how, and why. But when it comes to her real-life mystery, she leaves her fans dumbfounded? Dang, I'm starting to think this really was a publicity stunt. Honestly though, Agatha's writing would have been famous with or without the media frenzy of her vanishing. By the end of her career, she had written 66 crime novels and 14 short story collections. She paved the way for crime writers, women, and, I guess, surfers all over the world. So now that you've heard the story of Agatha Christie, what do you think happened? I think the amnesia theory makes the most sense, but the mistress last name thing throws me off. I just don't understand how so many days passed without anyone knowing anything. To stop me from asking any more questions, I'm gonna take a bite of this chicken and waffle breakfast sandwich and give my brain a rest. See you next time!
Hey guys, welcome back to Killer Bites, the show where we chat about true crime and flex our chef skills at the same time. Now I know true crime and cooking don't really sound like two things that should go together, but personally, I can't think of a better way to keep the vibes positive than with a little bit of comfort food. Now today I'll be telling you about the Wolf family murders, and while I do, I'll be making a delicious vegan goulash. Now you try to say that 5 times fast. Vegan goulash, no, I'm not even gonna try. You can find the recipe in the description box below. Now, I don't know about you, but the olden days kind of freaked me out. Not only because of all the racism, sexism, and misogyny, but it was so easy to get away with a crime. And today's case is about an entire family that was gunned down on their farm. Their bodies left undiscovered for days, and the only survivor was an 8-month-old baby found crying in her crib. This happened over 100 years ago, and it's still one of the most severe cases in North Dakota's history. So let's get into it. Now, before we go into it, I'm going to start by preheating our pan with some olive oil in the pan. Our story takes place in Turtle Lake, North Dakota, 1920. It's April, middle of the day, and there's this guy, John Kraft, who's getting kind of annoyed. See, he was waiting for his friend and neighbor, Jacob Wolf, to come over to his house to pick up some farming supplies and a couple of tools. It's in the middle of the day, and John starts to realize that he hasn't seen Jacob in days. Now, come to think of it, he hadn't seen anyone in the whole Wolf family. So one of them is bound to be seen at some point, right? So John and his wife start making their way over to Jacob's farm. Once they get there, though, things are immediately just a little weird. They walk up and see that their laundry was still in the clothesline from days before. It had even stayed through a big storm that passed through town. No one had taken it down, yet it wasn't like Beata, Jacob's wife, to just leave clothes undone, you know? It's kind of like starting a chore and then not finishing it. If I start a chore, I have to finish it. That's just me, though. John also notices that the horses are wandering around the property. Jacob and his family were well respected and they took care of their property. Everything is looking majorly out of place. The Crafts open the door to the home and find a trail of red fluid leading into the cellar. Now immediately, things are not looking good. Now when they opened the door to the downstairs area, they saw just a disgusting, horrifying sight. Now we're going to take some onions and we're going to throw them right into our saute pan. Now, Beata, Jacob's wife and mother to 6, had a bullet wound to the back. Next to her was Bertha with a single bullet wound and multiple hatchet wounds. She was just 13 years old. I'm going to be adding some green bell peppers to our onions. Lydia, at 6 years old, was also found with a bullet wound and hatchet marks. And then 3-year-old Martha, who was the only one not executed by a firearm, instead, she was beaten with the same hatchet that sliced her sisters. Laying on top was Jacob Hofer. He was a 13-year-old boy that worked for the family on the farm, doing chores, yard work, that type of stuff. Still, this isn't everybody in the family, so they kept looking through the house. And that's when they hear Emma, Jacob, and Beta's 8-month-old daughter screaming her head off. She had been in the house for 2 days with no food, sitting in her dirty diaper. She's the only survivor at this point. The crafts make their way to the cowshed to see if anyone is in there. They notice something poking out of a pile of hay, and upon further investigation, it was the bodies of Jacob and his 8 and 10-year-old daughters, Maria and Edna. Examining Jacob, it was clear what had happened. He passed away from 2 bullet wounds, one from far away and the other from an alarmingly close range. Whew, yikes. After finding everyone, the crafts run to the phone to call the police, but the line had been cut. Thunder crackles. They take Emma to their house and call the police from there. The media grabs a hold of this story, and people from far and wide hear about it. The newspapers were printing that this case was the most revolting and mysterious that has ever been perpetrated in the Northwest. And to give a little backstory on the political climate of that time, because yes, it's important, and yes, it's still important. Things have not changed, and I better be seeing you guys with your I voted sticker, or so help me. The governor of that time was a man named Lynn Frazier, and this guy had problems with the Attorney General, William Langer. Now I'm going to add my tempeh into my onions and bell peppers. There was an upcoming election, and Langer was thrusting after the Republican nomination. And I'm going to start to season everything. He's coming for your gig, Lynn. You better watch out. So a week goes by and no arrests have been made, and the public is flipping their lid. There's a criminal on the loose, and he's just taken out the most important family in town. Like, let's get a move on it, people. Come on. William Langer saw an opportunity and took it. While the governor is taking his sweet time to jump on this case, he thinks, what better way to secure a nomination than to solve a familicide? It's kind of genius. I'm not going to lie. So William sends his own personal team of private investigators out to Turtle Lake to see what's up. But he wasn't going to send them out there on the down low. He had to make sure that people knew he was the one who sent them. He's going for the gold, baby. Then all the headlines start popping up and people are pissed that no one has been arrested. But they're more upset that Mr. Lynn Frazier isn't taking action. This is so important, so put a pin in it for now. But let's continue. The people begin their investigation to figure what the hell happened on that farm. Who could be responsible for something like this? They send out the bloodhounds to survey the area up and down. But this has occurred 48 hours prior, and there was a good chance that whoever did it was long gone by now. And at this point in time, Turtle Lake only had a population of about 400 people. It's North Dakota in the 1920s. It's not exactly popping off. I mean, I would know, I got family there. But when people hear about what happened, they're shocked. This is horrifying then, and it's the same now. Over 2,500 people showed up to pay their respects or to be in the place where it happened, you know? People are weird and nosy like that. We just want to know everyone's business. It's our nature. Jacob was one of the Turtle Lake's most notable farmers. He was really up to date with the latest farming equipment and was incredibly hardworking. His whole family worked to support themselves, and as a result, he had a lot of fans. Most of the folks in the area were German Russian descent, and at that time, because of war propaganda, these were people being called executioners in the newspaper. So German Russian immigrants from all over, including out of state, came to the funeral. One by one, 8 coffins were lined up next to each other. The gravestone above read Die Ermordete Familie, which means the murdered family. Well, as people are mourning this tragic loss, someone at the funeral is acting straight up weird. Reports would say that Henry Layer, a neighbor to Jacob, was looking into each of the caskets, staring into the faces of the family. Seems like totally chill, normal funeral-going behavior, right? No. Here's the thing. Henry Layer and Jacob Poole have had some bad blood, and people knew it. Like, Henry and Jacob were neighbors, and more than a few times, some of Henry's cows had grazed onto Jacob's property. Now, whenever this happened, Jacob would sick his dogs on the cows to scare them off. Like, get off my freaking lawn! Thanks. You know. So one day, Henry's cows graze a bit too far, and one of Jacob's dogs starts to chase after it. But this time, a cow was injured. Henry starts to blow his top. He can't believe that this happened, and at the hands of Jacob Wolf's dogs, from that point forward, they had beef. While a few people in town knew about the drama with one another, they never imagined that things would go this far. When police questioned people in town, though, someone remembered Jacob running up to him on the street, scared that his neighbor would do him harm. Investigators are looking for clues around the property a few days later, and they see Henry being a weirdo again. They're in the barn, and Henry wanders over and tells the police that they should look in the chicken coop. Now, excuse me, sir, this is a crime scene. A few cops go up to the chicken coop and dig through the hay. And wouldn't you know, they find a bunch of bullet casings. On the way to jail, the police stop on the side of the road to arrest a criminal. Little did Henry know, he was about to be stuck in a cell with a private investigator. They want dirt and think that he's going to spill the beans. And now we're going to start to add our tomato sauce. They hold Henry there for hours. Police spend the entire time getting into Henry's head, threatening him and scaring him into admitting guilt. According to Henry, the officers told him that an angry mob ready to attack him was outside and the only way he could stay safe was to stay in jail. Good plan, guys. Well, it worked. Henry breaks down and confesses to committing the crime. He tells police that he went over to Jacob Bull's house a few days before to demand that he pay for the injuries his cow received from his dog. Now, Jacob straight up was like, bro, don't come at me like that. Just bounce. Well, Henry isn't that type of guy to take no for an answer, and he continues just to ask for money. And before we go any further, I'm just going to finish off by seasoning our sauce with some seasonings. Jacob gets annoyed and grabs his shotgun. I don't think he was actually planning on firing at the guy, but he needed to show he was serious. And that's when the guys start going at it, wrestling for the weapon, and it goes off twice, accidentally. And these hit Beta and the farmhand boy, Jacob. And when Jacob sees that, he starts running away. Then it's said that Henry proceeds to go inside to grab more ammo from a dresser drawer. And this is where the story doesn't fully add up to me, because how the heck would Henry know where they kept the extra ammunition? You ever try to find a cup in a kitchen that's not your own? Like, which cabinet is it? Why don't you keep it next to the sink? So many questions! Now, once Jacob collapses from the bullet in his back, Henry pulls the trigger again. This time from super close range. Graphic, I know, I'm sorry, but there's no other way around it. I have to tell you the story. Henry says after this, he hears screaming, and what does he do? He goes towards the screaming children, and this was 8 and 10-year-old Maria and Edna. They were in the house, and I assume had seen their mother on the ground covered in fluid. They escape through a window and run to the cow shed. Sadly, this would be a dead end for the both of them. The 3 children, Lydia, Bertha, and Martha, were attacked with a firearm and a hatchet. And luckily, you completely missed the wolf's 8-month-old Emma. I mean, she was in her crib, asleep, and Henry didn't think to look for her. And now I'm going to add my pasta. When he was asked why he didn't hunt down the baby, he said, the reason why I didn't kill the baby was, I believe, because I didn't go into the room to which the baby lay. Well, there you go. After this ravenous rampage was over, Henry got started on hiding the bodies. Just gonna clean up my mouth. For those in the barn, he covered them in some hay to make it less noticeable, I guess. The bodies in the house, however, he threw them into the cellar. Now, to me, this seems like a lot of work for one person. You're telling me that one guy, aged 41, was running around this entire property, having time to reload, chase people down, and hide their bodies, and no one has the chance to escape? Does that not seem so suspicious? The police get the confession that they wanted, and Henry is sentenced to life in prison. But once he's there, Henry retracts his confession. He said he was bullied into making it. Only after harassing him and scaring him into thinking his life was in danger did he confess to anything. But the police don't care. That's exactly what they want. Their goal is to tire you out, accuse you relentlessly, and get you in an emotional, vulnerable state. It's kind of like when someone's talking to you and you're like not really feeling the conversation, so you kind of just like want to like cut out of the conversation. The community wasn't so easily convinced that the police had found the right guy, though. Remember all that political stuff that I told you about earlier? Well, there's a reason the case wrapped up so fast. The election was coming up and William Langer was gonna get that spot. Now, on top of that, William offered up $1,000 to one of the PIs if he solved the case. Now, to me, it seems like there's a lot of political pressure. You want to win an election. You demand your staff to find the guy who did it immediately. And Henry was the guy to point fingers at. Now, just weeks after the massacre, the Wolf family farm was auctioned off. Now, guys, I'm saying weeks. Weeks here. Y'all ever heard of a thing called too soon? Well, this is it. Oh, and remember the funeral where Henry was staring at the family's faces? Well, everyone in the town is of Russian and German descent, and it's customary to have an open casket. But the media hyped it up to make him sound like a creepy dude who wanted to look at their lifeless bodies. And while Henry was in prison, his family back home was suffering. His wife couldn't do everything on her own, and his 4 children were put into an orphanage. 5 years into his prison sentence, after standing by his not guilty plea, Henry Layer would pass away from complications of appendicitis. I know the story has a lot of sadness in it, but there's some good that came out of it. Emma, the baby John Kraft found, was adopted by her aunt and uncle after the family's passing. She lived to 84 years old before she passed away in 2003. She lived a long life, even after living through a tragedy. So let's get on what we think really happened, because I have one theory and it isn't about Henry Layer, okay? I believe this was done by more than one person, perhaps a group of people. Now, could Henry be a part of it? Perhaps, but I don't think he was in on this alone. Number one, the amount of back and forth during the massacre from the entrance to the house to the barn, all this probably took some time. This gives plenty of outs for some of the family to escape, but no one does. Number two, how did Henry not hear the baby crying from upstairs? I'm supposed to just believe a baby is going to sleep through all that commotion and not make a sound? Why was she spared? The 3-year-old wasn't? Number three, Jacob had all the latest and greatest farming equipment, and the house was put up for auction immediately. Now, I think there's some jealous people who wanted their hands on what Jacob had. Number four, it doesn't make sense to me that someone could execute an entire family over a dog biting their cow. I know people do crazy things all the time, but like, really? Come on. Now, I want to know what you guys all think. What are your theories? Do you think that Henry actually did it? Maybe a gang? Do you think the police could have done better in their investigation? The answer is always yes. But is it time to eat this goulash? The answer for that one is absolutely yes. Well, that's all for me. Thanks for watching Killer Bites, you cool cats, and I'll see you guys all next time.
Give me smiley face. Give me murder face. It's good that you don't know what murder face is.
Yeah, right? I'm like, I know exactly what this is.
A 21-year-old dude from Indiana catfished a teenage girl by pretending to be a millionaire from Kansas and promised to give her $9 million in exchange for slaying someone in Alaska and sending pictures and videos of the scene. Any sane person would know that was sketchy, but of course this chick was all like, 9 million? Cool. The teen then rallied 4 of her friends and they got to work. But once the deed was done, she realized what she was mixed up in and things started to unravel. Speaking of mixed, today I'll be making mixed berry turnovers. On June 2nd, 2019, 19-year-old Cynthia Hoffman left home to go hang out with friends. After she had been out for a few hours without contacting anyone, her dad, Timothy, started to get concerned. He initially thought she went to the movies or the mall or something, but she wasn't answering any of his phone calls, so he had the feeling something bad may have happened. Timothy then texted Cynthia's best friend, Angela, asking if she knew where his daughter was, and let her know that he was concerned for her safety. In their text, Angela told Timothy that she dropped Cynthia off at a nearby park right before she vanished. She was really devastated about the whole thing, and told her dad's friend, "I hope she comes home safely. She's my best friend." And sometime in their message thread, Angela said, "I know she will come home safe." The reason Timothy was freaking out, other than the fact that he was an overprotective parent, was because Cynthia had a developmental disability that caused her to function at a 7th grade level. Because of her condition, Timothy knew Cynthia was more vulnerable than most 19-year-olds. And once 11:30 p.m. rolled around, Timothy called the police to report his daughter missing. Officers told him he had to wait 24 hours to report her as missing, but that didn't cut it for him, so he started searching for Cynthia himself. Timothy ripped his motorcycle through the town looking for his daughter. He put out search parties, scoured nearby wooded areas, and contacted a bunch of people, but all of his efforts failed. Cynthia was still missing. 12 hours after Timothy first called the cops, he contacted them again and they started a search for the missing teen. Officers talked to a few people who were close to Cynthia to see if they could find any clues that may lead to her discovery. Cynthia's BFF, Angela, told the cops that she and Cynthia were smoking the devil's lettuce with their other friend, Caden, who was a homeless 16-year-old. Homeless at 16? That's pretty rough. But after 2 days of searching, there was a knock at Timothy's door. He opened the door, saw the police, and from the look on their face, he knew that was it. Cynthia had been found, but she was lifeless. That morning, detectives were out searching for Cynthia by the Eklutna River. When they made it to a creek near the Thunderbird Falls hiking trail on the outskirts of Anchorage, they found Cynthia lifeless on the ground. Her hands and feet were bound with duct tape, and there was a strip of tape covering her mouth as well. After finding a bullet wound on her body, officials concluded that that was the cause of her passing. And just 2 days later, detectives identified their perp, Angela, who, much to Timothy's surprise, was actually named Denali Bremer. Since Angela, who we'll now call Denali, was the last person Cynthia was with, she was one of the first people to be questioned by the police. And when she got to talking, detectives had no idea what they were in for. Complete shookery. So Denali told investigators that she went to Thunderbird Falls with Cynthia and their other friend Caden. But somewhere along the way, Denali said Caden pulled out a firearm and knocked Cynthia out with a bullet. Detectives just had a feeling that Denali was lying. Investigators obtained a search warrant to look through Denali's phone, and that's when the truth started to surface. On Denali's phone, officials found a bunch of disturbing photos of a minor being tormented. With that frightening discovery, detectives got a second warrant to look through Denali's text messages and social media pages. In doing so, they found a bunch of awful photos and videos of Cynthia before, during, and after she was slain. They were sent to someone in Denali's contact list named Babe, who referred to her as Angel. And let me just tell you, this girl was far from an angel. In the conversation thread between Denali and her Babe, she went over her detailed plans to physically violate a teenage girl and record it for him. As officials searched deeper in the message thread, they found out that Denali's Babe was the one who assigned her to commit and record the crime in exchange for a large sum of money. $9 million to be exact. $9 million? That's a lot of money, and it would definitely be a motivator to commit a crime as horrific as what Denali did to Cynthia. Once Denali's messages were thoroughly searched through, here's what officials determined. Someone who was claiming to be a dude named Tyler from Kansas met Denali on the internet and gave her the assignment of the century. He convinced her he was a millionaire and said he would pay her $9 million in exchange for violating and slaying someone in Alaska. Denali, who was clearly hungry for money, was all like, "Yes, man on the internet who claims to be rich, I will absolutely execute someone in Alaska for you." But she didn't want to do it alone. Instead, Denali got 4 friends on board to help her carry out the crime for a cut of the money. Officials theorized that the group met sometime in May or June and discussed how the whole shebang would go down and how much money each person would get for their part in the crime. It is believed that Cynthia was an easy victim for Denali because of her disability and the fact that they were BFFs. In a later interview, Timothy said his daughter was so excited to have friends and just loved hanging out with them. So based on that bit of information, it's safe to assume that Denali wouldn't have much trouble convincing Cynthia to hang out that day. But before Denali's big performance, she told her Babe, Tyler, that she was gonna go buy some good green so she could get Cynthia high before going after her to prevent her from fighting back. Can we just take a moment to address how awful of a friend Denali is? Like, I get she wants this money from Tyler, but why wouldn't she go for a stranger instead? I just can't believe she had the guts to do something so terrible to her friend. So on the day of the incident, Denali's sidekick, Caden, borrowed a car from his 19-year-old friend, Caleb. Caden and Denali told Caleb that they'd give him $500,000, and after hearing that number, Caleb was probably all like, "Sweet, here's the keys, have fun." And once Caden secured the whip, he went to pick up Cynthia and Denali. Both friends made Cynthia believe they were all just gonna go on a hike, but as soon as they got to the Thunderbird Falls trail, they strayed from the path and headed for a more secluded area along the river. Somewhere along the way, Denali and Caden stopped and somehow convinced Cynthia that it would be a great idea to duct tape each other and take pictures. Cynthia went with it at first, but once the tape was around her wrists and ankles and over her mouth, she started to freak out. Man, all of these crimes are really ruining duct tape for me. Denali and Caden then took the duct tape off, and Cynthia started yelling at them, saying she was gonna call the police and report them for abducting her. At that point, the demented duo knew there was no going back. Caden reached for the 9mm Glock that Denali had and fired the bullet in the back of Cynthia's head. In Caden's interview with detectives, he claimed he blacked out, but he said he did remember pulling the trigger and pushing Cynthia in the river. Denali, on the other hand, first told officials that she had no idea Caden was going to grab the Glock and pull the trigger. Throughout the process, Denali was sending pictures and videos to Tyler on Snapchat. She then posted a super sketchy video on her Snapchat where she said, "I'm sorry everybody, my family, my friends. I guess you will hear from me when you hear from me, but I won't be back for a long time. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do it." After Denali and Caden finished the job up, they decided to text Cynthia's family and tell them that they had just dropped Cynthia off at a park in Anchorage. After that, they put up the front that they had no idea what Cynthia was up to or who she was with. Okay, but then why would Denali post her confession for all of Snapchat to see? And how did Cynthia's family not find out about it? This is getting messy. Well, I guess Denali and Caden really did want to keep it under wraps, because after everything was said and done, they burned the weapon and Cynthia's belongings. But after Denali sent all of the gruesome content to Tyler and that Venmo hadn't hit yet, she started to doubt their agreement. Later in the conversation, Tyler told Denali that he wished he had never made a deal with her in the first place. He claimed they would meet up, but told Denali the moment he saw a cop, he'd rat her out for committing the crime. And right around then is when Denali found out that she was being catfished. After doing some digging, it was discovered that Tyler from Kansas was actually a 21-year-old guy named Darren Schillmiller from Indiana. Turns out, he was using some random dude's picture to lure Denali in, and I'm sure you've already guessed it, but he wasn't a millionaire. Once the cops found Denali's Snapchat confession, they brought her in for another round of questioning. At that point, Denali knew the jig was up and told the cops about the whole setup. She said Darren offered her money for slaying her bestie and even told them that she was also instructed to physically assault 2 minors, one who was 8 or 9 years old and another who was 15. FBI agents found proof that Denali sent Darren photos of the 15-year-old she went after, but there are no records of the younger victim Darren assigned his teenage hit woman to go after. In the end, Denali and Caden and Caleb were indicted alongside 2 other teens who remain unnamed due to their age. That's insane. These were just kids running around doing whatever was needed for some dollar bills. Darren, the mastermind, was also charged for the crime after he admitted to telling Denali to slay her bestie. In this interview with officials, he said that he had been planning the event for 3 weeks with his new Alaskan hit woman. All 6 defendants had been charged with the crime in the first degree and took the plea not guilty. We're still waiting for the final decision to be made for the 6 perps, but they're all facing very hefty sentences that sit right around 99 years in prison. While it's clear Denali did all of this for the money, there is still so much mystery about how she was able to do something so horrific to someone who was so close to her. Cynthia's dad described his daughter as super trusting and loyal. After Timothy found out the truth of what happened to Cynthia, he was livid. Yeah, I am too. In a press interview, Timothy said that if someone was playing a game with Cynthia, she would believe the game until it went too far. That day, he believed Cynthia thought it was a game and didn't realize the truth until it was too late. Ugh, that is so sad. Poor girl thought she was going on a fun hike with friends, and then boom, a bullet. I think Denali takes the cake for the worst friend ever. Timothy also posted a really sad and strange poem titled "Nightmare in My Head," where he summed up what happened to his daughter and kept rhyming the word head over and over again. Which, like, is it technically a rhyme if you're using the same word? Either way, I'm not gonna tell Timothy how to mourn something so tragic. If rhyming on Facebook is your way to cope, then like, hey, so be it. You know, I can't get over how many disturbing elements there are to this story. Not only was Denali on board with the plot to slay her bestie, but she was also able to get 4 other people to help her, and she recorded some of it on Snapchat. On top of that, what does Darren have to do with any of this? Why was this random Indiana man so set on getting Denali to do such terrible things to Cynthia? How did she get so very mixed up? As badly as I want the answers to those questions, I may never get them. So instead, I'm just gonna do what I do best and eat some sweets. Who's hungry for turnovers?
Hey everyone, welcome to Killer Bites, a show that features insane true crime stories and drool-worthy recipes. Yep, you heard that right, crime and food. Think of it as a way of lightening the mood of the cases we discuss and providing you with something nice to look at. In today's episode, I'm going to give you all the deets about the Coleman family murders while making some loaded nacho fries. If you're curious, the recipe is in the description below. From serving in the Marines to working as a bodyguard, Chris Coleman had always been keen on protecting other people. Now, you think that would translate to his family at home, but one day Chris's wife and two sons were found lifeless, and all signs were pointing to him. As sketchy as Chris seemed, he claimed the crime was committed by televangelist haters who were sending him threatening letters. To get started, I'm going to put these fries in the oven. It was 6:42 a.m. on May 5th, 2009 when Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow's phone rang. He picked it up and heard the voice of his neighbor, Chris Coleman. Chris said he was worried because his wife, Sherry, wasn't answering his calls. He asked Justin to check in on his wife and kids and told him he'd meet them there in about 5 minutes. Okay, but why couldn't Chris just check on them when he got home before calling Justin at 6:42 in the freaking morning? Well, Justin agreed to go over there. He threw on his clothes, grabbed his gear, and called a dispatcher at the police department in Columbia, Illinois to notify them of his visits. An officer named Jason was already in the area, so he met Justin there for the welfare check. When the two officers knocked on the front door, no one answered. So Justin stayed at the front of the house while Jason headed around to the back to check things out. Moments later, Jason radioed Justin and said, "You'd better come back here. There's a window open. The screen's out." That doesn't sound good. The men called for backup and climbed through the window. They drew their weapons and slowly started making their way through the basement and up the stairs. There was a strong smell of fresh paint, and as soon as Justin and Jason made it to the first floor, they realized what it was. Spray paint on the walls. Super concerning words and sentences were written in red spray paint throughout the kitchen. "Punished. I am always watching, and you have paid" were just a few of the things Justin and Jason read. Now I'm going to saute some onions and garlic in a pan with oil and balsamic vinegar. The spray paint continued up the stairs, so the officers decided to follow the trail. Meanwhile, Chris just pulled up in the driveway as well as another cop, Steve. This was 13 minutes after Chris said he'd be home in 5 minutes, by the way. Steve told Chris to stay outside while they searched the home. Jason headed for the master bedroom, Steve went down the hall, and Justin entered one of the kids' rooms. Justin saw a little boy lying in the bed, and at first glance it looked like he'd been sleeping. But as Justin got closer, he noticed the boy's limbs looked stiff and his skin was almost gray. In the master bedroom, Jason shouted out to the men saying he found Sherry, Chris's wife. As for Steve, he peered in the doorway and found another little boy lying motionless in his bed. All three of the Colemans had no pulse. It was too late. There were marks on their necks that suggested they were throttled, and Sherry had ligature marks and a black eye, so it was clear she put up a fight. While still upstairs, Steve warned his fellow officers, "This might be our guy. Limit what we tell him." The three men then made their way downstairs and out the front door. Chris was notified that his family didn't make it, and he just sat on the ground crying. He didn't really ask any questions about how his family was snuffed or anything, which the cops found pretty odd. Like every homicide case, Chris was brought in for questioning with Justin and another detective named Dave. Since Chris was the only surviving member of the family, they thought he might have information to help detectives put the pieces together. It's also protocol to ask next of kin information about the victims and such. In his interview, Chris said he got up that morning at 5:30 and headed out for the gym. On his drive, he called Sherry, but she didn't answer. Chris went about his workout, and on his way back home, he called his wife again. When she didn't pick up this time, Chris called his detective neighbor to go and check in on his wife, and, well, you know what happened from there. Detectives asked Chris about the suspicious marks on his arms, and he responded, "I think it was when I was the gurney in the ambulance. I was hitting the pillow." Okay. They also asked him about his military background and current job. So the thing about Chris is he worked a pretty high-stakes job. He was the bodyguard for the famous Christian televangelist Joyce Meyer. Although Joyce had a lot of fans, her controversial beliefs and speeches earned her a lot of haters as well. While most of those haters targeted their threats at Joyce, several of them went for Chris too. Chris told the investigators about the threats that he received in emails and letters. One email read, "Deny your God publicly or else. No more opportunities." Both publicly and opportunities were misspelled. Another said, "Tell Joyce to stop preaching the bullshit or Chris's family will die. I will kill them all as they sleep." Whoa, hold up. Someone directly threatened to snuff his family days before it actually happened? That might be something there. One time, while Chris was traveling with Joyce in Hawaii, a scary letter was delivered to his home. Sherry was super freaked out because Chris wasn't there, but once he got back in town, they filed a police report and Columbia cops amped up their patrol in the area. Around that time is when Chris first reached out to his detective neighbor Justin to tell him about the situation. Justin agreed to set up a camera in his son's window that faced Chris's mailbox. That way, if anyone else delivered another threatening letter or even came by to break in or attack the family, it would be caught on camera. But with all of the increased security, officers never saw anything suspicious, and the camera didn't capture anything out of the ordinary. The detectives were also a bit skeptical about these threats too. Why would anyone make such malicious threats to the random bodyguard, they thought? During the whole interview process, the detectives kept going in and out of the room to take breaks. In reality, they were touching base with their colleagues who were finding a lot of dirt on Chris, including the information that Chris had a more intimate relationship with his female family friend Tara than he first let on. The plot thickens. The investigators came back into the room and brought up Tara's name again. Chris admitted a few steamy phone interactions with her, but reassured them he would never cheat on his wife. Chris told the detectives that he saw Tara at a Joyce Meyer conference in Florida, but he casually left off the part about him also meeting up with her in Arizona and Hawaii, getting promise rings together, and talking about tying the knot. I'm sorry, what? Chris claims to have talked about splitting up with Sherry at one point, but after going to therapy, he said things got much better in their marriage. He went on and on about how much money he made as a bodyguard and said he'd been planning a trip to Disneyland with Sherry and the kids. But the detectives already knew that trip had been canceled, and Chris had booked a vacation to the Virgin Islands with Tara. That's an interesting place to go with your family friend. Now I'm going to add in the plant-based meats as well as green onions and a spice mixture. At the end of his interview, Chris reiterated that his wife was alive when he left her that morning, and he assumed some criminal was waiting for him to leave so they could go inside and harm his family. He said whoever did this deserved to be put away in jail. After Chris's interview, the detectives knew he was lying. His wounds, his affair, and his lack of questions about the crime made investigators put him at the top of the suspect list. But at the time, they still had no physical evidence against him, like the weapon or spray paint can. They also hadn't gotten the autopsy reports yet. While Chris's parents, who were both pastors, told the cops there was no way their son would do such a thing, friends of Sherry's thought otherwise. Investigators looked through Sherry's messages with her friends and discovered she was extremely unhappy with the way Chris treated her and her kids. Chris apparently told Sherry he wanted a divorce because she and their two sons were getting in the way of his job. Last I checked, it takes two people to get married and have kids. In one text to a friend, Sherry wrote, "If something happens to me, Chris did it." Yo, I'm really starting to think that's the case. Chris is acting super sketch. But on the other hand, the letters and emails make it seem like some psycho Joyce Meyer hater did it, right? Get a load of this. Investigators found out the threatening email sent to Joyce Meyer, her son, and Chris from the email address destroychris@gmail.com actually originated from Chris's laptop. And a lot of Chris's work files included the word opportunities misspelled the same exact way as it was in the threatening email Chris received. Bro, have you heard of autocorrect? It will save you from future embarrassment and incriminating evidence. When detectives went through Chris's phone, they found a notes tab labeled Tara. It included her height, eye color, pant size, bust size, and all of her favorite perfumes, flowers, and ring cuts, as well as their future daughter's name, Zoe Lynn Coleman. OMG. This is insane. Chris also wrote down a few dates. One said, "The day Tara changed my life, 11/5/08." And another was her dog's birthday. Okay, I'm impressed Tara knows her dog's birthday, let alone Chris. As if it wasn't already clear that Chris and Tara were serious, investigators found plenty of explicit photos exchanged between the two. But even though Chris was all about Tara, he seemed to despise his wife. Friends and neighbors mentioned Chris and Sherry were never intimate with each other anymore, and Chris was also very vocal about his frustrations. He lamented to one of his neighbors that he worked 80 to 90 hours a week protecting some millionaire lady I don't even like, while my old lady gets to sit at home in this nice big house. Later, he complained about how much money Sherry would spend and expressed his desire to divorce her, but knew he'd lose his job if he did. I'm guessing because divorce is frowned upon in the Christian faith. But so is adultery, buddy boy. On May 19th, a big break was made in the case. A well-known forensic pathologist was brought in to examine the bodies, and on the 19th, he called to confirm that Sherry and the kids were all executed before 3 a.m. If you remember, Chris said Sherry was still alive when he left around 5:45. With that, officers arrested Chris and charged him with manslaughter. Since the trial was set for April 25th of 2011, there was still a lot of time for detectives to gather evidence. And boy, did they find something spicy. When looking through Chris's credit card charges, officials noticed a $3.77 purchase from February 9th at a hardware store. They called the store to find out what it was for, and the clerk said he bought some spray paint, Rust-Oleum, apple red. Got him! On the day of the trial, Chris rolled up with a bulletproof vest on. Dang, you know you're hated by the public when that's your court outfit. So, the prosecution presented a pretty solid case to prove Chris was guilty. They went over incriminating evidence that we've already discussed and highlighted the many motives Chris would have to do something. So as you already know, Chris was having marital issues and Sherry was clearly fearful for her life. But as much as Chris wanted to divorce her, that would mean he would get fired from his job, losing all of his money. Chris and Tara's relationship seemed to be getting serious, and authorities suspected Tara was giving Chris ultimatums. But if he couldn't get a divorce without losing his source of income or being condemned by the church, there seemed to be one solution: to execute Sherry. To back up this claim, prosecutors showed scandalous photos and videos between Chris and Tara. Chris seemed to have thought this through for a while and tried to make it seem like the crime was committed by someone else. The emails, the letter, the spray paint, it all seemed to be a part of Chris's plan. At the trial, several witnesses were brought to the stand to give their 2 cents about the crime. Tara got up there wearing her promise ring and a cross necklace. She admitted her relationship with Chris and said he promised to give Sherry divorce papers on May 4th. But then he apparently texted back saying there had been a typo and he was going to do it on May 5th, which is the same day Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin Coleman were slain. While Joyce Meyer wasn't at the trial in person, she sent in a pre-recorded video where she talked about her relationship with Chris. She said she knew Chris since he was a kid because his parents attended her conferences. Joyce admitted to knowing Chris and Sherry were experiencing marital problems, but said she had no idea he was having an affair. In April of 2009, Joyce reported Chris starting to act strange. He wasn't as attentive and kept forgetting things. On May 4th, aka one day before the crime, Chris called Joyce to ask if he could have the day off because he wasn't feeling well. Joyce said he had never done that before. When the defense presented their side, they pointed out the lack of direct evidence that linked Chris to the crime. They harped on the fact that the officials were unable to find any specks of spray paint on his clothing, which Chris could have just destroyed, and they reiterated that the weapons still hadn't been found. On top of that, the defense attorney said Chris had no criminal record and even said Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin could have passed away after 5 a.m., even though medical professionals concluded otherwise. Well, on May 5th, 2011, which happened to be the 2-year anniversary of the crime, the jury came back with their verdicts: guilty on all counts. Chris Coleman was sentenced to 3 life terms without the possibility of parole, and the crowd waiting outside of the courthouse went wild. But that's not where the story ends. Despite the verdict, Chris maintained his innocence and requested a retrial. His attorney filed a petition arguing that the jury's verdict was based on the explicit photos that should not have been presented in the way they were. When reviewing the evidence, the judge granted the prosecution permission to present some of the raunchy pictures between Chris and Tara, but said their genitals had to be censored. But there were 4 uncensored images with timestamps placed on the back of an evidence display. Chris's team apparently found out that some of the jurors said those images and the timestamps on them affected their decision that day. At the beginning of the deliberation process, it was allegedly 7-5, and after seeing these images, all 12 jurors came to a consensus because the dates on the photos weren't consistent with Chris's testimony of when he and Tara began seeing each other. Thankfully, after thoroughly reviewing the evidence, the judge dismissed Chris's petition for a retrial because he didn't think the way the evidence was handled would have changed the case. So it seems like Chris will be stuck in the slammer for life, and I couldn't be happier to hear that. You want to know something though? I almost hate Chris's dad, Ron, just as much as I hate the criminal himself. When asked about his son's affair, Ron literally tried to justify it by saying Tara was just meeting a need that Sherry at the time wasn't taking care of. I mean, every man has got his desires and every man has to be respected. It's built into every man. If your wife doesn't respect you, then you're going to find respect someplace else. Isn't that so annoying? And the dude is a pastor. He's basically approving of his son committing adultery. Get a load of that. And get a load of my loaded nacho fries. They look amazing, don't they? Well, I guess there's only one way to find out. See you next time. Greetings, loved ones. let's take a journey. Yes, I just quoted a Katy Perry song. You're welcome for reminding you of that era. Today on Killer Bites, I'm going to tell you about the case of Blair Adams while I make an apple cider cake. If you'd like to bake with me, you can find the recipe in the description below. There are a lot of confusing true crime cases out there, but this one might be the most confusing one I've ever heard. A dude from Canada emptied his bank account, shoved all of his jewelry in a fanny pack, and bought a flight to Germany. He ended up canceling that flight, trying to cross the border to the United States 3 times, renting 2 cars, and driving around Knoxville, Tennessee, where he rented a room at a Fairfield Inn to never even stay there. Instead, he was found the next morning lifeless in a parking lot surrounded by cash. Was he slain by someone, or did he knock himself out in a manic episode? First, I'm going to start off by mixing the dry ingredients together of flour, coconut sugar, baking soda, baking powder, salt, cinnamon, and nutmeg. One July morning in 1996, 2 Tennessee construction workers were going about their day when they found the body of a lifeless man. He was lying on the ground of a parking lot at a hotel in Knoxville that was under construction. As these stories typically go, the workers notified the authorities and they rolled up to the scene. Once officers got there, they noted the man was half naked, covered in bruises, and surrounded by money. His pants and shoes were off, his socks were turned inside out, and his shirt was ripped open. He also had a long strand of hair in his hand. That's odd. Around the area, cops found the man's missing garments as well as a fanny pack and duffel bag. The fanny pack contained $2,000 worth of cash, gold bars, coins, and jewelry. The duffel bag had maps and receipts inside. Gold bars? Were those still a thing in 1996? Authorities also found a car key that belonged to a Toyota Camry and a key card to a room at the Fairfield Inn. In total, the dude had somewhere around $4,000 in American, Canadian, and German currency scattered around his body. Officials were able to identify the man as Blair Adams, a 31-year-old from Canada. They sent his body off for an autopsy where medical examiners reported a lot of cuts and abrasions on his body, some of which were defensive wounds. It also seemed like he had road rash from being dragged or hit by a car. And there was a wound on his forehead that appeared to be from a crowbar or club. The injury that ended it all was a fatal blow to his midsection. This caused Blair's stomach to rupture, which sent him into septic shock sometime around 3 that morning. Yikes. Examiners held the belief that Blair was physically violated, but they couldn't confirm the theory with DNA evidence. Even still, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. The way his clothes were definitely suggests something like that occurred. So what happened to this dude? And who did it? And why? There are so many questions. One of the first things the investigators did was contact Blair's family. In talking to his mother, they learned that Blair recently came to the US from Canada and he was acting very strange in the weeks leading up to his travels. But as much as Blair's mom tried to figure out what her son's deal was, he said he couldn't tell her about it. The only thing he told her was that people were spreading rumors about him. What is it? What were these rumors about? We need to know. So Blair was originally from Surrey, British Columbia, aka somewhere in Canada. And get this, he worked in construction. I wonder if it was a coincidence that he was found by construction workers at a site they were remodeling. Blair's friends and family members described him as outgoing, friendly, and positive. But just like his mom stated, other people said he was acting weird more recently. People said Blair was super paranoid, stressed, sleep-deprived, and moody. Join the club. And even though that might be the norm for some people, this behavior was extremely out of the ordinary for Blair. But coroners found no traces of alcohol or substances in Blair's system when they performed the autopsy. On top of that, he was never diagnosed with a mental illness. Not to say he didn't have one, but if he did, it went undiagnosed. Basically, Blair was a very normal and upbeat guy, but when the summer of 1996 hit, his whole demeanor changed. On July 5th, he went to his bank and withdrew all of his money, which totaled around $6,000. He also took out all of the gold and jewelry from his safe. After that, Blair went to his mom's house and said he was going to visit his uncle who lived about 4 hours away. But when Blair got there, his uncle wasn't home. The following morning, Blair tried to board a ferry from Victoria, BC to Seattle, but was denied entry by U.S. immigration officers because they thought Blair might have been a dealer or something due to the amount of cash he had. He also lied to officers saying he had no criminal record when he did. Now I'm going to add in applesauce, apple juice, and maple syrup. So Blair left the border and went to visit 2 of his friends. He told them he needed to get to the U.S. because someone was trying to snuff him and asked them to take him to the border. From what I've gathered, Blair didn't go into detail about who this enemy was or why they were going after him, but he told his friends he couldn't go back to his apartment. Okay, this is getting scary. Blair's friends said they couldn't drive him to the border, so he left their place and went to his mom's house to stay the night. The next morning, Monday, July 8th, Blair left his mom's house for the final time. Later that day, Blair spent $1,700 on a round-trip plane ticket to Frankfurt, Germany. Blair had been to Germany in the past and even had an old girlfriend who lived there, so it wasn't the strangest place for him to try and flee to. But when detectives reached out to his ex, she said Blair didn't tell her anything about him coming out there, and he never even got on the flight. In fact, he canceled it and got a refund because he hadn't given up on his goal of crossing the border into the United States. In the wee hours of July 9th, Blair was spotted by the Pacific Highway border crossing between Canada and the US. When the authorities saw him, they immediately perked up because he looked just like a suspect for a car theft that just happened in Vancouver. Officers spoke to Blair thinking he was a suspect, but he maintained his innocence, and aside from a few scratches on his limbs, there was no real evidence to prove Blair was involved in the crime, so he was released. Side note, one of Blair's friends later said Blair was driving in that car, they just didn't know it was stolen at the time. To make things even more confusing, Blair was apparently driving his own car later that day. He drove it to the Vancouver airport, where he abandoned it and rented a Nissan Altima. In his new rental, Blair somehow successfully made it across the border into Seattle. From there, he parked his rental car at the Seattle airport and boarded a flight to Washington, D.C. The one-way ticket Blair bought was about $770, and a detective who worked on the case said he could have purchased a round-trip ticket for approximately $350 or $400, so it would have been half the price for a round-trip ticket as he paid for a one-way ticket. It just seemed very unusual. On the morning of July 10th, Blair landed in D.C. and rented another car. This time he went with a Toyota Camry that he began driving south towards Knoxville, Tennessee, heading out right around 6:45 a.m. Let me just say, Blair has impeccable taste in cars. Both Altimas and Camrys are reliable, get good gas mileage, and drive like a charm. But also, why did he fly to DC and then drive to Tennessee when he could have just gotten a flight straight to Tennessee? That makes no sense. Well, at 5:30 that evening, Blair stopped at a gas station near Knoxville where witnesses reported his odd behavior. Blair was having issues getting his car to start, which he was freaking out about hardcore. When an interstate repair service driver named Gerald came to help, he looked at Blair's car key and was like, "Bro, that's the wrong key." Blair had been trying to start his Camry with the key from the Altima in Seattle. But even after Gerald pointed that out to Blair, he insisted he was using the right key and refused to look for a different one in his pockets. So Blair just kept trying to use the key to the Altima until Gerald stepped in and told Blair he would give him a ride to his hotel if he just got the Camry towed to a nearby mechanic shop where he could figure out the key thing later. Gerald personally dropped Blair off at his hotel, the Fairfield Inn. After doing so, Gerald realized Blair left his bag at the gas station, so he went back to pick it up and swung back by the hotel so he could drop off Blair's bag. What a good citizen. We need more of those. Blair's strange behavior didn't stop after he got to the Fairfield Inn. A woman who worked at the hotel said the best way to describe him would be paranoid. He was just very nervous, agitated, expecting someone to come in on him even though there wasn't anybody there. I don't know who he was looking for, but he was waiting for somebody to walk in for him. Before Blair even got a room, he kept entering and exiting the lobby a bunch of times, like at least 5 times within 45 minutes. After finally paying for his room and getting a key, Blair left the hotel through the front door at 7:37 p.m. He didn't go up to his room, and he never came back that night. The next morning at around 7 a.m., his body was discovered by the 2 construction workers, which brings us back to the investigation. So with all of this knowledge, it's still unclear as to why Blair was in Tennessee and who was after him, if his claims were true. Blair's mom later said in an interview that her son was planning to attend the 1996 Olympic Summer Games in Atlanta, Georgia later that month. She said that was why he must have been in Tennessee. But investigators looked into this theory and found no evidence of Blair intending to go to the Olympic Games or Georgia in general. Officers also spoke to Gerald since he was one of the last people to see Blair, but he didn't know what happened after dropping Blair off at the hotel. Gerald did say this about Blair. He didn't appear to be messed up. He didn't appear to be on drugs, but his mind wasn't functioning correctly for some reason. Gerald complied during the entirety of the interview and even agreed to give hair samples for officials to test against the strand found in Blair's hand. The interstate repair service worker wasn't a match, but he was never really considered a suspect to begin with. Oh, and if you remember, the key to the Toyota Camry was found at the crime scene, which is the correct key Blair needed to start his car at the gas station. So he really did have it the whole time. That is such a mood. I can't tell you how many times I search for my shades when they're literally on top of my head. Another lead that detectives looked into near the beginning of the investigation had to do with the food Blair ate before passing away. In the autopsy, medical examiners concluded Blair ate food from a restaurant shortly before he was slain, and one witness reported seeing Blair talking to a guy at a nearby Cracker Barrel. But nothing ever came of this lead, although I hope the detectives ordered a breakfast platter at the iconic restaurant chain. As for the hair found in Blair's hand, it was tested for DNA, but there were no hits. Literally any time a hint of a lead came about, it was immediately ruled out, leaving detectives with more questions than answers. As of now, there are no solid clues or known suspects. Blair's case remains unsolved, leaving us, true crime fanatics, to piece together the theories. One of the most popular theories to this day is that Blair hired an escort and the exchange went bad. Case followers thought the escort or pimp could have planned the exchange as a setup to rob Blair, but when he started fighting back, they whacked him. There was even a report of a woman's scream coming from the direction of the parking lot around 3:30 a.m. People speculated that the woman screaming was the escort reacting to the pimp striking Blair. Another sub-belief in the escort theory is that the exchange began in a car, and when Blair resisted the robbery, he was smacked in the head, thrown out, and hit by the car, which caused his stomach to rupture. As legit as this idea sounds, detectives were never able to find any proof to back it up. They found no record of Blair hiring an escort, but it could have obviously been a cash transaction. Even still, it wouldn't explain Blair's obscure behavior or travel itinerary. And the idea of a robbery gone wrong just doesn't seem viable, considering the fact that basically all of Blair's money, gold, and jewels were still at the crime scene. Another popular theory is that Blair was dealing with an undiagnosed mental illness, such as paranoid schizophrenia. As scared as Blair was of this alleged person out to get him, authorities were never able to find evidence of someone making attempts, let alone anyone who despised Blair enough to do something bad. Schizophrenia is a mental illness that doesn't appear until people are in their 30s or later, which would explain why Blair seemed upbeat and normal until the summer of 1996. The most common signs of schizophrenia include mood swings, erratic behavior, anxiety, detachment from work, friends, family, experiencing delusions, and more. Yep, that checks out. So it seems like Blair was experiencing the beginning stages of schizophrenia, and the rumors being spread about him, as well as the person threatening to slay Blair, were all just living in his head. This is because his claims have never been backed by proof, and it would make sense with the whole money still at the crime scene thing. But if that's the case, was Blair still iced by someone else, or were his wounds self-inflicted? That's another question people struggle with. Some think Blair could have had a mental breakdown where he ripped his shirt, took off his pants, jabbed himself with something sharp, and delivered the final blow to the gut with his fists. Others say that's impossible. There's no way Blair could have given himself all of those injuries. Plus, what about the hair in his hand and the examiner's theory of forced intimacy? Another theory is that this crime had to do with Blair's sexuality. His mother allegedly said in an interview that Blair had a relationship with one of his male roommates. Now I'm going to top this off with cinnamon, sugar, and a glaze. Back in the 90s, homosexuality wasn't as accepted as it is today, and to be real, we still have a long way to go. But if someone found out Blair was gay, they could have targeted him. Another thought is that Blair was supposed to meet up with a potential suitor or a one-time fling, and something went wrong. To me, this seems pretty viable. People are willing to do crazy things for love, like cross the border, rent a bunch of cars, and buy plane tickets, although it still doesn't account for the ticket to Germany or Blair's personality shift. Ooh, maybe that was the guy he was allegedly seen with at Cracker Barrel. Actually, I'm not sure a Cracker Barrel would be the best place for two gay men to meet out in Tennessee in the 90s. As you can see, there are a million theories and sub-theories about this case. And yet, none of them fully explain the way Blair was acting, why he traveled where he did, and why he was found with no pants, yet surrounded by money. So what do you think? Was someone really out to get Blair? Was this an escort situation gone wrong? Did he travel to Tennessee for a lover or the Olympics? Or did he do all of this to himself because of an undiagnosed mental illness? The world may never know. But what I can find out for you is how many bites it takes to finish one of these apple cider cakes. Thanks for watching. Hi there, you're watching Killer Bites, a show where we talk about true crime while making something delicious in the kitchen. There's nothing people love more than a good discount, which is why platforms like Facebook Marketplace, Poshmark, and OfferUp are so popular. But before there was Facebook Marketplace, there was Craigslist. The forever outdated looking platform is responsible for finding homes for so many people and their things, but it's also responsible for many crimes, including the robbery, abuse, and even one execution at the hands of an unsuspecting med student named Philip Markoff. I'm going to start off by heating up cherries, raspberries, and blueberries with cornstarch, cinnamon, lemon juice, and sugar. On April 20th, 2009, Philip Markoff was arrested during a traffic stop near Boston, Massachusetts. He was on his way to a casino with his fiancée Megan and several $1,000s in cash. Now, Philip may not have known it at the time, but the police were following him for several days because they suspected him of committing a bunch of terrible crimes against women, all of whom were scammed on Craigslist. So now that I've lured you in with the initial arrest, let's go back a bit to learn more about Philip and these crimes he is being accused of. Philip grew up in a small town in upstate New York. His parents divorced and remarried new spouses early on, but both households seemed to be good to Philip and his brother, showing them that hard work and determination could get you far in life. Philip was described as nice, polite, funny, and extremely smart, so it was only natural that he attend SUNY to pursue a career as a doctor, which is where he met his girlfriend Megan McAllister. They were both students at SUNY and became smitten with each other immediately. Philip ended up graduating with a bachelor's in biology in just 3 years and got accepted into med school at Boston University. The couple moved to Boston and set their wedding date, but Megan didn't get into any of the schools she wanted to, so she decided to put her education on hold and focus on wedding planning. Yo, planning a wedding really is a full-time job. There's just so much work that goes into the little details that I'll never understand. Yes, this has to be perfect. Anyway, as smart as Philip may have been in school, he wasn't the smartest with his finances. Obviously, he already had a lot of school expenses because, of course, in America, education costs more than a house. From his undergrad alone, Philip had right around $130,000 in student debt, which literally makes me want to vomit. Like, heaven forbid someone wants to learn something beyond high school. Sorry, bud, you want to be a doctor? That will be $500,000. But beyond that, Philip had a bad gambling addiction and was so competitive about it that he didn't seem to be good at acquiring money, which did not pair well with the student loans and wedding planning. Zoinks. Sometime around 2008, Philip began to scroll through Craigslist, and it wasn't to look for furniture. Let's just say, it seemed like Philip wasn't feeling very fulfilled in his relationship because he seemed to send all these messages through Craigslist ads that made himself seem real thirsty. In May of 2008, Philip sent a message saying, "Hey sexy," under the email sexaddict5385@yahoo.com. That may have gotten edited out, but just know it was a raunchy email address. What happened to the random yet innocent email addresses and screen names people would use back in 2008? The worst I had was Gangsta Penguin, and that was named after Club Penguin, which was a game I was obsessed with. Well, let's get back to the task at hand, Philip's creepy Craigslist messages. So after sending the first intro message to this person, Philip sent them explicit photos, which, based on the way things were going, I'm sure you could predict that was coming. He seemed to have messaged that same person a few more times over the next several months, but they never met up in person that we know of. Philip probably used that thread to test the waters, though, because he went on to message others on the platform in a similar manner. Most of the people Philip hit up were men who posted ads on Craigslist labeled M4T or men looking for transvestites. He also apparently posted scammy listings of his own. This one time, Philip posted a listing faking to be an ebony erotic masseuse looking for male clients. The post said, "Taking my last appointment. Why get a massage if you're going to be uncomfortable? I'm sure I will leave you satisfied. My donation is $150. Wait, I'm confused. This listing is giving me mixed messages. Is the massage supposed to be uncomfortable or satisfying? Actually, I do not want to know the answer to that. Well, Philip eventually went past the just messaging phase with these people on Craigslist. On April 10th, he found a listing that caught his fancy and decided to reach out. The listing was posted by a 29-year-old Las Vegas-based escort and masseuse named Trisha Leffler. She was visiting Boston and offering up her services to anyone looking to come spend some time with the sweet blonde. In the posting, she said, "Give me a call so we can spend some time together." And that's just what Philip did. He dialed her number to see what this girl was all about. Trisha answered the phone, told Philip her rates, and the two decided on him purchasing an hour of time with her. They agreed to meet up at the Westin Copley Place Hotel, and within 30 minutes of hanging up the phone, Philip showed up. He called Trisha when he got to the hotel, and they met up near the elevator. Trisha mentioned in an interview that she always meets with her clients in a public area at first, just to make sure they're not too creepy or anything. And Philip was this regular-looking, tall, blonde med student. He didn't give Trisha any bad vibes at first, so they continued up to her hotel room. But once they got up to the room and closed the door, Philip's demeanor shifted entirely. He pulled out a firearm to threaten Trisha, tied her up to a doorknob using zip ties, and gagged her so she couldn't scream. He then stole $800 in cash, a $250 American Express gift card, and a debit card from Trisha, but thankfully, Philip didn't hurt her physically. After collecting as much money and cards as he could, Philip fled the scene. Trisha said she complied the whole time and didn't resist in any way, which is why she thinks she survived the attack. But sadly, Philip's next victim wouldn't be so lucky. Now I'm going to get started on the dough. I'm going to mix flour with baking soda, baking powder, salt, and sugar. Then I'm going to add in butter and almond milk. Just 3 days later, Philip was browsing the erotic services section of Craigslist again, which is a section of the platform that would later be changed to adult services, but it has since been removed. He replied to an ad posted by a 25-year-old masseuse and aspiring model named Julissa Brisman. But he sent all of his messages under the fake name Andy. After going back and forth a bit, the two agreed to meet up the following evening at the Copley Marriott. Once Philip and Julissa got into a room together, Philip attempted to rob Julissa in the same way he did Trisha. It looked like he tried to tie her up and she tried to fight back, but once Philip pulled out his pistol, all bets were off. Philip pistol whipped her, fired at her 3 times at a close range, and left her lying there in a pool of her own fluid. Julissa was still alive upon first discovery, but after getting transported to the Boston Medical Center, she passed away. When the cops first responded to the call about Julissa, they had no idea who had done this to her. Julissa's friend then looked through the victim's emails and found the thread between her and Andy. She forwarded them to the police and they began searching for ways to identify him. Meanwhile, Philip wasn't done with his Craigslist crimes. In between gambling sessions at the Foxwoods Casino in Connecticut, Philip found himself another victim, Cynthia Melton. She was an exotic dancer who posted an ad for her lap dancing services. Philip contacted her using a track phone and they made an appointment to meet up at the Warwick Holiday Inn Express at 11 p.m. on April 16th, just 2 days after Julissa's attack. Once Philip and Cynthia were in a hotel room together, Philip pulled out a firearm and told Cynthia to lie face down on the ground. He then tied her hands behind her back with zip ties and attempted to silence her with a ball gag, which is a device typically used by sadomasochists, aka Philip. Cynthia put up a bit of a fight by continuously shaking her head, so Philip wasn't able to get the device on her mouth. Instead, he just cut straight to the chase. You know, the whole give me your wallet thing. Cynthia said Philip seemed super nervous as he was tearing apart the room looking for her money. True story, I used to play Grand Theft Auto on the PlayStation 2 as a kid, and I remember the main character just running around saying, "Give me your wallet!" And that's what I feel like Philip was doing here. Also, I'm completely aware that I was way too young to be playing GTA, but the early versions of the game were super pixelated and not as inappropriate as they are today. So please don't come for my parents. They were good to me, I promise. Anyway, as Philip was frantically searching for money to probably gamble with, he told Cynthia, "Don't worry, I'm not going to kill you. Just give me the money." Don't worry? The poor woman is tied up on the floor and you have a Glock. I think she has every right to be worried. But here's where things get crazy. While Philip was grilling Cynthia about the location of her cash, there was a knock on the door. It was Cynthia's husband, Keith. Oh shit. Philip aimed the barrel of the weapon at Keith, who started walking backwards to try and avoid getting fired at. Keith backpedaled to the hallway, where he tripped and fell, giving Philip time to run down the stairwell and get away from the scene. But now it was only a matter of time until Philip got caught, because not only did 2 of his victims thankfully survive to tell their story to the cops, but there was also the husband, Keith, who laid eyes on Philip as well. Investigators were able to pull footage from the Holiday Inn security cameras where they caught a glimpse of the man walking in that evening. Through other surveillance footage and witness statements from the 3 incidents, detectives had a solid idea of what their perp looked like. They were looking for a young, white, clean-cut male who was about 6 feet tall with blonde hair. Cynthia mentioned he was wearing a baseball cap. Police then went through the various email threads and phone conversations between the women and their attacker, and investigators were able to trace an email that Andy sent Julissa. The electronic trail led straight to Philip's apartment in Boston. At the time, officers had Philip's name, but they couldn't find his driver's license. So they did some digging and found a Facebook page that Megan created for her and Philip's wedding. From there, they found out Philip was a med student at Boston University, so they were able to find his student ID picture, and it matched the guy in the surveillance footage. For the next few days, officers followed Philip to monitor his whereabouts while they continued to gather evidence to tie him to the crimes. They were even able to locate one of his texts from the night of Cynthia's attack to the area surrounding a Walmart. From that, they were able to determine that Philip purchased a baseball cap right around 10 p.m. And if you remember, Cynthia said her attacker was wearing a baseball cap and they met up at 11, so everything added up. I wonder if Philip bought that hat as a disguise. That would be kind of embarrassing if that was the case. He bought this hat on rollback thinking it would hide his identity, but little did he know it would be used as evidence to connect him to the crime. Well, once investigators felt they had enough evidence against Philip, they decided to arrest him for the crimes. As I told you earlier, the cops pulled over Philip when he was on his way to the good old Foxwoods Casino with several $1,000s in cash and his girlie Megan in the passenger seat. Officers put Philip in cuffs and accused him of armed robbery, abduction, and execution charges. The cops took him to the station while they sent a team of investigators to search his apartment for more evidence. Here's what they found: bullets, cash, zip ties and duct tape, a few track phones, a hard drive that had messages between him and Julissa, several pairs of women's underwear, 2 of which belonged to his first known victim, Trisha, and last but certainly not least, detectives found a semi-automatic firearm inside a medical textbook that had been hollowed out. Seems like this one is pretty easy to solve. On April 21st, Philip was arraigned on slaughter and weapon charges. He pleaded not guilty. Come on, dude. It's pretty obvious. Not even 2 days to his time in jail, Philip was placed on close watch because there were shoelace marks around his neck, so it was clear he attempted to take his own life. Everyone was shook when they heard that the sweet and intelligent Philip Markoff was being accused of such outlandish crimes. Philip's friends even created a Facebook group titled "Philip Markoff is innocent until proven guilty." Okay, that just makes me want to crawl into a hole forever. It's so sick. But I mean, these people thought they knew Philip. He had this whole persona, and I mean, the boy was literally straight out of an early 2000s Hollister ad. It took some time for these people to digest the fact that this white med student could do such awful things. Newsflash, crime knows no type, so let's get rid of the idea that a clean-cut white man can't be awful too. I could actually name several of those dudes who are terrible. John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, and so on. Philip's soon-to-be wife, Megan, stayed by his side despite the allegations and evidence that screamed her boo was guilty. She told news outlets that Philip was a beautiful man inside and out. He would not hurt a fly. She said, "I just can only hope that the criminal justice system will not be overwhelmed and persuaded by what is being put forth in the media. My fiancé's fate should not rest in the court of public opinion, but rather in a court of law." You know, as much as I want to shade this woman, I'm sure she was in denial about it all. Can you imagine being in Megan's shoes? Here she was thinking she was about to marry a smart, kind, and driven person who loved her, and now she just found out he'd been living a double life on Craigslist where he was doing terrible things to other women. Dang. Also, their wedding was coming up in just a few months, so Philip's arrest had to put a damper in all the planning. But by May, the wedding was called off and Megan decided to leave Philip. Now I'm going to assemble the cobbler, starting off with the fruit mixture at the bottom, and I'm going to crumble up the dough on top. While in prison, awaiting his trial, Philip tried to end his life on multiple occasions. On August 15, 2010, which was a year and a day after he was supposed to marry Megan, Philip was found lifeless in his jail cell. A deputy sheriff made rounds a few times and thought it was weird that Philip hadn't moved at all, so he went in for a welfare check and pulled Philip's blanket back to reveal a grisly scene. Since Philip knew a lot about the human body from his medical background, he slashed major arteries in his neck, legs, and ankles with an item that he shaved down to act like a razor. One officer said he filed down a jail-issued pin, another said he used a silver receptacle plate that was used to cover an outlet. Either way, Philip had to get super crafty and creative, and it was clear he'd been planning this for a while. He also stuffed toilet paper down his throat and put a plastic bag over his head and covered himself in a blanket. Ugh, that's not a pretty sight. But that wasn't all. Before he got into his final setup and after he punctured himself with his makeshift blade, Philip wrote "Megan" on the wall in his fluid. He also wrote what looked like "pocket," but no one has been able to decode what he meant by that. There was no official farewell note or any other piece of evidence to suggest why Philip took his own life, but between the charges he was facing and his disturbed mental state, I'm just gonna guess those were the leading factors. After word got out about the crimes and the identified perp, a few more people came forward to share stories of their sketchy run-ins with Philip. One man came forward stating Philip responded to his ad about a transsexual hookup, and he said Philip sent him photos, but they never met up. And one of Philip's old classmates from SUNY said she went out for drinks with Philip one time in 2005, where he pushed her up against the wall and tried to make a move on her. Since she was smaller than Philip, it was hard for her to push him off, but thankfully one of her other guy friends came over and pulled Philip off of her. She mentioned not thinking anything of it at the time, but now that these stories came to light, she is even more grateful for her friend who intervened. Who knows what would have happened to her if he hadn't stepped in. And that just goes to show that Philip probably went after many more victims than the 3 women in 2008. But why? A lot of people think it was solely for money. Since Philip loved to play poker and was in a bunch of debt, he clearly had a need for money, and that seemed to be what he was after in his 3 known attacks. But I mean, if he really was just money hungry, I feel like he wouldn't take his victims' intimates or approach them the way he did. Not to mention the fact that Philip had been reaching out to other listings on Craigslist in a very erotic way. So there was probably some form of creepy obsession in the world of sadomasochism, as well as an undiagnosed mental illness of sorts. And that is the story of the Craigslist killer. It's creepy, shocking, and just plain tragic. While Philip pretended to be this scholarly student who loved his fiancée, he was actually preying on people posting their services on Craigslist. At least 3 women were threatened by this guy in awful ways, and it's a good thing he was caught because I'm sure he would have continued to go after others. Well, this story makes me never want to go on Craigslist ever again. I actually found my first apartment on Craigslist, and it was not a good apartment, so I think I'll stick to Zillow or something more reputable. Anyway, please be careful out there when interacting with strangers on the internet. Sadly, not everyone is as sweet as this cherry berry cobbler. Thanks for watching, everyone.
When the Denver police showed up to a grisly scene one cold October night in 1941, they couldn't help but scratch their heads. With no sign of a break-in and no evidence of any kind, it was as if their suspect had simply vanished into the night. What they didn't know, as they tried to figure out who their suspect could be, was that their attacker didn't resemble much of a man at all. This is the ghost house of Denver. And today I'm making enchiladas. So Philip Peters was a retired railroad worker who lived in this cute white house on West Moncrief Place for over 30 years. He lived there with his wife Helen, and the two became empty nesters after their kids moved out to start families of their own. Peter and Helen were also musicians, and Peter was a member of the Denver Guitar Club, where he and his wife would teach guitar and mandolin lessons in their spare time. I love how in the 1940s, the way to make friends was by starting clubs of things you had a general interest in. Just some middle-aged bros vibing with their buddies and their guitars. So wholesome. In September, Helen fell and accidentally broke her hip, so she had to spend 5 weeks in the hospital to recover. Because it was the 1940s and gender roles were still a huge thing, Philip was pretty much helpless without Helen, and didn't know how to cook and clean for himself during those 5 weeks. Well, that and the fact that he's 71 years old. Aw, poor guy. So Philip's neighbors helped him out, and they switched off inviting him over for meals with their families. They'd also make sure he had a bunch of leftovers to take home for lunches that he could cook up the next day. But on the night of October 17th, when Philip didn't arrive at a neighbor's house for their scheduled family dinner, the neighbor got worried and called the police. The police got to the home and noticed that all of the doors and windows were locked. When no one answered the door, the police burst in and discovered the battered body of Philip Peters. He was super banged up, but there were no signs of anyone having broken into the house. It's as if the attacker had vanished into thin air. Detectives began digging into Philip's past to try to figure out if he had had any enemies. But along with the who and the why, the detectives would have the most daunting task of trying to figure out the how. How the heck did the person get in and out of the house when every door and window was locked? The detectives were quite literally dealing with a locked door mystery. And on top of that, they also had the near impossible job of delivering the news to little old Helen, who was still recovering from a broken hip in the hospital. No, Helen. Helen hired 2 nurses to help her out when she returned home in February, but she actually ended up falling and breaking her hip again, going back to the hospital, then heading back home in April. But once Helen and her nurses were settled in, they started to notice some strange things happening around the house. First, the nurse named Edith said she heard noises in the walls. She could also hear soft footsteps coming from empty rooms. The other nurse, Hattie, noticed that there were some things out of place. She also mentioned that the meals she set out on the trays for Helen seemed to rearrange themselves all on their own. But Helen was hard of hearing, and she didn't seem to notice any of these disturbances. Things continued to happen around the house, so the ladies began to tell the neighbors of their suspicions. They thought the house was haunted, and believed that whatever happened to Philip was eventually going to happen to them. When Edith reportedly saw a door creak open and a thin white hand slip out while she was working her night shift, she screamed so loud that the neighbors called the cops. The police did a full search of the property, and when they found nothing, Edith noped right out of there and resigned on the spot. Within 2 weeks, Hattie also quit, as she would tell the press later, "I wasn't gonna stay in no haunted house." Helen obviously was not about to spend a night alone in her haunted house, so she went to stay with her son in western Colorado, turned off her utilities to her home, and left it once again. Helen's next door neighbor to the now vacant home was named Mabel. When Helen moved out, Mabel noticed that the blinds in Helen's house were starting to change positions every time she looked at them, despite no one reportedly being in the house. But then police started to get reports from other neighbors who said they could see a silhouette walking around the house in the nighttime. But every single time the police responded to one of these calls, they found nada. For 5 straight days, 2 officers sat outside the house in a stakeout and watched with agonizing boredom as nothing happened. Of course, once the press heard the news of this, the story immediately made headlines, and it was dubbed the Ghost House of Denver. While most of the residents thought this was just a tall tale for papers to sell, the police weren't so sure anymore. They were still faced with the mystery of how a man was attacked in a home with locked windows and doors. In July of 1942, when 2 officers pulled up for their usual routine to check the property, they swore they saw something move inside. The 2 nervous detectives went inside and didn't see anything downstairs. And that's when they heard a noise upstairs. The 2 detectives sprinted up the stairs and into the back bedroom straight towards the tiny closet. When they opened the closet door, they saw a pair of feet dangling in front of them. Those feet are attached to a pair of legs that are hanging from a tiny crawl space in the ceiling. So the guys grabbed the legs and yanked out this long, pale, emaciated, ghoulish-looking man. The man was wearing rotten clothes that were held together with rope and had a .44 caliber revolver in his hand. He was 6 feet tall, and when they found him, he only weighed 75 pounds. They immediately arrested the putrid man and hauled him downtown for questioning. Initially, he lied about his name and who he was, but when the cops gave the man a hamburger, an apple pie, and a coffee, or as a high schooler would call that, the breakfast of champions, after that, the man was finally ready to tell his story. The man told officials that his name was Theodore Edward Coneys, and he would soon be given the nickname by the newspapers as the Spider-Man of Denver. Theodore told the police that he had gotten to know Philip Peters through the Denver Guitar Club when he was growing up. His mother passed when he turned 18, and after having all her savings stolen by a con artist, she left him with nothing. The young couple noticed their new friend was struggling, so they often invited him over for dinner and offered him some company after his mother passed. They eventually helped Theodore get a job at a gas and electric company. But after quitting his job to start a get-rich-quick scheme with a friend that ends up backfiring, Theodore found himself drifting across the states and unable to keep a job. In 1941, he eventually found his way back to Denver, Colorado, where he knew the one place where he could turn to for company and a warm meal, the Peters house. It had been almost 30 years since they'd last seen Theodore. All he wanted to do was go to the Peters house, ask them for some money and something to eat. But when Theodore got there, no one was home, so he decided to go around back and poke around. He claimed that the back door was left unlocked, so he let himself in and grabbed himself some food from the kitchen. Trespassing is still trespassing, home skillet. Theodore said he spent a few hours snooping around inside the house when he decided to check out the upstairs bedroom. In a back closet that was being used for storage, he found a small panel that functioned as a little trapdoor to a crawl space in the attic. This crawl space was legitimately only the size of a coffin. And that's when he realized that this would be a warm place to stay for the winter, which is exactly what he did. For weeks, he laid in the attic and crept downstairs when Philip would go visit Helen in the hospital. He said he couldn't take more food than was noticeable and would take it back to his nest to eat it. Eventually, though, Theodore got bored and decided to play one of his new favorite games, following Philip around the house and shadowing his movements without him noticing. He said the game was fun and gave him a thrill. Despite the fact that Theo was getting comfortable, his stay was about to take a spicy turn. One day, when he thought Philip had left for the hospital, Theodore crept down for his usual icebox escapade. But Philip had been taking a nap and was startled awake by a noise in the kitchen. Theodore claimed in a split-second decision that he grabbed the old revolver from the wall and beat Philip until he stopped moving. Then he grabbed his food and went back upstairs. The dude ended up staying from October all the way through July. The police sent their teeniest, tiniest officer to go up inside the crawl space and have a look around. When the officer painfully squeezed himself in there and got a look around, he literally tossed his tacos. Because Helen had turned off the utilities, it was stanky up in there. Theodore didn't shower once during those 9 months. And I'll let you infer what he did to take care of his bathroom needs. It doesn't involve indoor plumbing. An officer said that a man would have to be a spider to be able to stand in there. And thus, the man, the myth, the legend was born. Theodore said that the very first time the officers investigated the home, they almost found him. He said he was sitting on top of the small trap door when the officers were pushing on it, and he heard them talking about how it would be impossible for anyone to fit through that space. According to him, his entire 9-month stay in that attic was a stay in hell. I've always wanted to vacation in hell. I wonder if they've got any brochures I could look at. First came the winter months in the attic, where he said his feet nearly froze off. He told them he'd never committed a crime before, not even a petty one, and then he slayed a man. Theodore was charged and convicted by a jury and was sentenced to life in prison with physical labor, which is where he would eventually pass away at the age of 84. When Theodore's sentence was read to him in court, he said that he finally felt safe knowing that he would have a better home than he'd had in years. He claimed that if Philip had never found him that day, he would probably still be alive. As he explained to the cops the day they brought him downtown, it was him or me. And that is the insane yet true story of Theodore Edward Coney's, the ghost house of Denver. Do you love how I had you go in there for a sec thinking that there was a real ghost slayer in history that you never heard about? I know. I just had to do it to you. Because just like a good enchilada, this story has layers. See you next time on Killer Bites.
Hey you! Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Killer Bites, a show where we talk about true crime while cooking. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the mind-boggling disappearance of Cheryl Miller and Pam Jackson. As much as we love to know the answers to everything, sometimes cases go cold without us ever finding out what actually happened or where the victims are. When two South Dakota teenagers named Cheryl Miller and Pam Jackson went missing in 1971, tens of years passed without any real clues surfacing. But one day in 2013, a case would finally be solved when a local noticed something sticking out of a nearby lake. Keep watching to find out what it was. In May of 1971, Cheryl and Pam were headed to a big end-of-year party. Those last days of school vibes are just unmatchable. Like cupcakes in class, signing people's t-shirts with Sharpies, and writing hags on everyone's yearbook. Remember? Have a great summer? Anyway, there's these two 17-year-old girls got in a 1960 Studebaker Lark, aka my next dream car, and headed to the big summer bash, but sadly they never made it there. The party was apparently at a gravel pit in rural Union County. When the girls never showed up to the party and then they never returned home that night, it was clear something had gone wrong. Some of the girls' classmates were driving in front of them to the party, and when they looked back at one point, they said it was as if Cheryl and Pam's car just vanished into thin air. Chitty chitty bang bang. Well, Cheryl and Pam were both eventually reported missing, but this was in 1971, and in that era, there was no Amber Alerts, no missing persons Facebook pages, and law enforcement just didn't have access to the advanced technology that we have today, such as thermal imaging and ground penetrating radar. When a person went missing, you just hope and pray that they'd show up soon, and it was highly likely that they were just a runaway. Cheryl and Pam were both teenagers who probably had hopes and dreams of moving to a big city, so who knows if they just took their Studebaker Lark to New York or LA without telling anyone. So at this point, Cheryl and Pam are missing, but foul play wasn't even really a thought. running through the police officers' heads. Most people believe the girls must have gotten lost and possibly drove off a dead-end road into the Missouri River. But when investigators searched the river and nearby roads, they were unable to find any evidence of the girls or the car. The other main theory, which we've already covered, was that they ran away, but both families were adamant that Cheryl and Pam weren't the types to just leave like that. Pam's older sister even pointed out the fact that Pam didn't pack any of her clothes or medication. So if she did leave town, it wasn't a planned event and definitely wasn't on her own accord. In the beginning stages of the investigation, the cops didn't do much of anything. And even worse than that, they didn't really keep track of what they did look into. Witness statements weren't logged, detailed notes weren't made, and there wouldn't really be any good files for future detectives for reference. Most of the search parties at the time were hosted by friends and family of the girls, and sadly, they didn't lead to any other solid clues. The officers who worked on this case put most of their focus in the gravel pits that the girls were headed to that day. As investigation technology advanced over the years, officials revisited the case using new techniques and tools. They took 3D pictures of the gravel pits, searched the area with ground-penetrating radar and metal detectors, and even considered using sonar, but again, they were really only looking in the area surrounding the gravel pits. Days turned into months, months turned into years, and years turned into decades. As more and more time passed, it felt like the case would go cold forever, and everyone would have to move on with their lives without knowing where Cheryl and Pam or what happened that day. But in 2004, officials got a warrant to search a farm in the area. It wasn't made public at the time, but later it was revealed that investigators were searching this specific farm because it was where their main suspect, David, lived at the time of Cheryl and Pam's disappearance. David went to school with Cheryl at one point and attended a church function with Pam. So in 1990, he was arrested and charged for assaulting and abducting a woman, which got him a 227-year sentence. So I'm sure you can guess why he was the lead suspect in Cheryl and Pam's case. During their 4-day search of David's family farm, investigators found a red purse, women's clothing, a pair of rubber gloves, some pictures and newspaper articles that seemed to relate to the case, and sketchiness of all, they found bones in the septic tank. Sounds like we have the perp on lock. And as if that wasn't enough evidence, detectives went back a few months later and found 2 hubcaps and car parts. So it's not really clear what happened in the investigation over the next few years, but in 2007, David was charged for the crime. In addition to the evidence against the criminal, a prison informant was able to get a confession out of David, and he recorded the whole entire thing. But not so fast. In February of 2008, it was discovered that the recorded confession was fake, so prosecutors dropped the charges. Oh my god, wait, what? Who is this prison informant? And maybe they were the real perp and tried to frame David for the crime. But I mean, David was going to stay in jail regardless because he was already sitting on a thick prison sentence. After the confession proved to be false, all of the other evidence followed suit. The bones retrieved from the septic tank turned out to be the bones from a woodchuck, cows, and chickens. How did the investigators miss that? I feel like chicken and human bones are much different in size. All the other pieces of evidence weren't able to be directly tied to Cheryl or Pam, so they were all returned to David's family and the case went cold again. But come 2013, there would be another break in the case, and this time it was legit. So there was a huge drought in South Dakota in 2013, and that caused water levels to reach record lows. During the drought, one of the case followers noticed wheels of a car peeking out from a nearby creek. The witness informed the police, who tried to get the car out of the water, but it turned out to be a much more challenging exhumation. Thankfully, officials were eventually able to pull the vehicle out of the creek, and it was the same 1960 Studebaker Lark that Cheryl and Pam took off in decades ago. It was in the water this whole time? Are you serious? Everyone and their mothers had searched nearby roads and bodies of water. How did they miss this? Honestly, it's not really clear since the detectives didn't make thorough notes back then, but the bottom line is the car was found, which meant the case might finally be solved 42 years later. 42 years. Are you guys hearing me right now? How wild is that? In the rusty car, investigators found 2 sets of human remains, clothing, and Cheryl's purse, which had her driver's license, some pictures, and a few notes from classmates inside. Based on the fact that Cheryl's license was in the car, investigators wanted to make sure that the bodies were really Cheryl and Pam's, so they sent the remains to an anthropology department at the University of North Texas for DNA testing. While the tests were underway, detectives in South Dakota were trying to piece together what actually happened. So when the bodies were recovered, they were in the front seat. The detectives thought that if foul play had occurred, the girls would have been in the back seat or the trunk and their clothes would have probably been missing. The car was in third gear, the keys were still in the ignition, and according to the headlight switch on the dashboard, the lights were on. These elements were all consistent with the car accident. On top of that, there were no cans or bottles in the car that proved the girls had been drinking or anything. Well, the DNA test came back and confirmed that the remains belonged to Cheryl and Pam. After thoroughly examining the bodies, coroners determined there was no signs of foul play or inappropriate conduct. It really did seem like the girls got into a high-speed car accident that landed them in the water. One of the tires appeared to be a bit damaged, so it's possible that a blowout is what caused the accident, and the bridge that the car fell from was just built 1 year prior, so most people assumed that the victims weren't familiar with this bridge, which didn't help when the blowout happened. But even still, how did no one find the girls or their car for 42 years? That's a question that remains unknown to this day, but there are always theories. The first theory is that with the construction of the new bridge, the creek was deepened significantly. Maybe the car landed in a super deep hole where it rested for years until the wheels were spotted during the drought. The second theory is that the car moved over time. Members of law enforcement as well as concerned citizens claim to have searched the Brule Creek area frequently and thoroughly. There were no way that the car landed in the exact same spot it was recovered from 42 years later. According to aerial photos, the creek's channel had shifted over time and the banks have moved. It's possible that the creek moved, so did the car. But I still don't get how someone wouldn't have seen this thing. It's not like it's a smart car or a Mini Cooper. It's a decent sized car. The third and final theory is that the detectives didn't actually search the creek as often and rigorously as they claimed they did. And as I said earlier, the first detectives assigned to the case did an awful job taking good notes about what they did and did not investigate, so there wasn't much to go off of. They couldn't have just done a bad job at looking in Brule Creek, since it seemed like they were more focused on looking near the gravel pits. Whatever the reason, it's crazy to me that it took over 40 plus years and a false conviction until the real answers came to the surface. It's sad that Cheryl and Pam lost their lives that day, but I hope that their friends and relatives are able to find some closure in knowing that they weren't tortured or harmed before passing away. One of the saddest parts about the whole case is that Pam's dad, Oscar, lost his life 5 days before the bodies were discovered. He dedicated his life to finding his daughter and her friend, and in his obituary, it even mentioned that one of the saddest parts of his life was not knowing what happened to his daughter. And even though he wouldn't see the day where Pam was found, other family members were, and they were very grateful. After the autopsies were over, Cheryl and Pam's remains were returned to their families for a proper burial. During a press conference, the Attorney General read the following statement on behalf of the families of the victims. Our day has come. Through this journey for answers pertaining to our beloved sister Cheryl and dear friend Pam, we will now be able to finish the last chapter of this journey. With the help of all of our police forces, our family and friends, our family cannot thank you enough for the continued support you have given us. We are now able to carry out our mother's last wish. Oh, it's such a bittersweet moment. I mean, it really is so sad what happened to those girls, but I'm glad the families were able to kind of get closure after all those years. Can I just say that this story is such a good reminder to never give up hope? Like, seriously, don't give up hope. But even though there was a silver lining to the story, wait until you hear this. So the attorney who represented David Licken, aka the guy who was falsely accused of whacking Cheryl and Pam back in 2007, said that the state has still never apologized for the false allegations and invasive search. The attorney general who represented the state said that search was done legally and with full intention of trying to help the family of a community find 2 missing 17-year-olds. One of the sheriffs chimed in and said that they had no regrets about the investigation, stated the only unfortunate thing I would add is for the Licken family for what they had to go through. But I don't make any apologies for doing our job. I'm a bit conflicted about this part because David is still a terrible person who deserves every year in jail he was sentenced to for his previous crime. But his family's home was ripped apart and he wasn't responsible for this crime. Who would have guessed that after nearly 43 years, one of the first theories ever proposed would prove to be true? They got into a car accident and drove into the water. Freakishly enough, Cheryl and Pam's car was found just about a week after 2 other cars were recovered from a lake in Oklahoma that were also connected to missing persons cases around the same area and time. And while I'm here, I'll give you a quick rundown of those 2 cases because they're just as insane as the first. So in April of 1969, 3 adults went missing after they went out for a drive in a 1953 green Chevrolet. According to newspaper reports, the trio was last seen when someone helped them push their car to get it started. It's not clear what the circumstances were and how in-depth the investigation was, but just 1 year later, another Oklahoma trio went missing on the same road. I wonder if people in the area started to freak out about going out on drives now. In the second incident, 3 teenagers named Jimmy, Leah, and Thomas all went for a spin in Jimmy's new blue Camaro. And this car was like brand spanking new. Jimmy literally bought it 6 days earlier. They were headed to a football game and never made it there. Again, not much was mentioned about the original search, but come 2013, both cases would be solved when a state highway patrol officer was trying to use new sonar equipment on Foss Lake, and he came across 2 cars with corpses in them. And I bet that trooper had no idea that they were about to solve 2 40-something-year-old cold cases. That deserves a promotion right there. Anyway, once the cars were pulled up out of the water and DNA tests were run to confirm the corpses were in fact the missing people from the 2 cases, officials started to make note of any evidence that might explain what happened. In the teenagers' Camaro, investigators found 2 rifles and alcohol bottles. The car was also in neutral, which hinted at the possibility of foul play. In the adults' cars, there were also bottles of alcohol, but no other real clues. Were these both drunk driving incidents? I mean, it's possible, but as I'm sure you know, with all these true crime stories that we talk about, anything is really possible. And who's to say that these accidents were actually carried out on purpose by some sick individual who wanted to send people to their graves early, and the method they chose was by leading them into a body of water? Nothing's off the table, really. Actually, these mozzarella sticks are about to be off the table because I'm gonna eat them all right now. I wish you all to be safe out there and keep an eye out for more cars in the lake. I mean, who knows? How many other missing report cases from the 70s can be solved if we keep our eyes peeled? Catch you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.
In this episode, I'm going to tell you about some of the craziest lawsuits of all time while making the most obscure dish I've ever heard of: dilly dogs. So the first lawsuit we'll discuss actually has to do with a criminal. In September of 2009, a 27-year-old Denver resident named Jesse Dimmick needed to get out of town because the authorities had him pinned as a suspect in a homicide and they were trying to find him. So Jesse fled to Kansas and needed a place to stay. He busted into the home of a newlywed couple, Jared and Lindsay Rowley. Jesse apparently told the couple that he was being chased by someone who was going to kill him and he needed to hide somewhere. He asked if they could hide him in their home in exchange for money, and by asked, I mean he pretty much told them. Well, the Rowleys unwillingly said yes because it was a sort of hostage situation. According to neighbors, Jared and Lindsay were terrified, but they gave Jesse snacks and even watched a movie with him until he fell asleep. When they knew their guest was in a deep slumber, the Rowleys figured it was time to run away and call the cops. Once Jesse was arrested, the Rowleys took him to civil court to demand $75,000 for breaking into their home and causing emotional distress. Jesse was super peeved, so he counteracted their lawsuit with another lawsuit accusing Jared and Lindsay of breaking a contract. In the court documents, Jesse wrote, "I, the defendant, asked the Rowleys to hide me because I feared for my life. I offer the Rowleys an unspecified amount of money, which they agreed upon, therefore forging a legally binding oral contract." Yeah, he was seriously trying to sue the couple for him breaking into their house and trying to hold them hostage. Well, Jesse's lawsuit was eventually dismissed because the Rowleys' attorney said in order for parties to form a binding contract, there must be a meeting of the minds on all essential terms, including, and most specifically, an agreement on the price. In May of 2010, Jesse was found guilty on 2 abduction charges and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was then sent back to Colorado to stand trial for the homicide case that he was the #1 suspect in. Once again, Jesse was found guilty and got 37 years added to his sentence. I hope you enjoyed that movie night with the Ramseys because it doesn't look like he'll be getting one of those anytime soon. I'll be the first to say that food packaging can be deceiving, but even still, I never get upset enough to go after the companies, let alone stop buying the products. That wasn't the same for Missouri resident Robert Bratton. He wanted justice. Robert said he'd bought over 600 boxes of Reese's Pieces and Whoppers over the past decade, and the amount of air in the boxes hadn't changed. According to Robert, about 30 to 40% of a 5-ounce Whoppers box and 4-ounce Reese's Pieces box is empty, or slack fill. He believed that to be a misleading practice and said it violated Missouri's consumer protection law. So, Robert filed a class action lawsuit against the Hershey Company. And get this, he asked for $5 million in damages. $5 million for perfectly good candy he consciously chose to purchase. When the judge took a look at the paperwork, she probably laughed out loud before coming to her conclusion. The judge said Robert wasn't in the right because he knew the boxes were slack-filled, yet he kept buying them. She said although Mr. Bratton claimed to have always clung to his hope that the boxes would be full, he acknowledged that he did not expect the box to be miraculously filled the next time he bought it. As defeated as Robert was, he put all his energy into his second lawsuit against the candy company. Robert's other lawsuit was against Tootsie Roll Industries for the same thing, just with junior mints. He claimed there weren't enough junior mints in each box, which he believed broke the consumer protection law. As of now, no decision has been made on the lawsuit, but apparently 2 other people in New York also tried to sue Tootsie Roll for the same thing in 2018, and their case was dismissed. That judge came back with a 44-page decision explaining why a reasonable customer can expect some empty space in their box of candy. Next on the roster is good old Richard Overton. This dude filed a lawsuit against Anheuser-Busch, the parent company of many popular beer brands, including Budweiser. So Richard was a hopeless romantic. He was sad, lonely, and desperately wanted a lady friend. One day while watching TV, he saw a Budweiser commercial where a guy drank a Budweiser beer and got all these girls. Then Richard continued to see more Budweiser commercials and ad campaigns that depicted all these gorgeous women in tropical settings, all centered around this beer. It was like, if Richard drank Budweiser, all of his dreams would come true and he could score himself a girlfriend. So Richard went to the store for a 6-pack or 2, chugged a few beers, and waited for all the girls to come to his yard. None of his dreams were coming true. He felt lied to by Budweiser and thought they should be punished for false advertising. So off to court he went. In 1991, Richard filed a lawsuit against Anheuser-Busch for $10,000 to cover the emotional distress, mental injury, and financial loss he experienced from buying all those cases of Budweiser. He said he was purchasing and consuming all that booze just to lure in pretty women like the ones he saw in the Budweiser ads. When he hadn't attracted any girls, Richard felt scammed by the company. Anheuser-Busch acknowledged that their products were potentially dangerous in the realm of addiction and health problems, but at that point they were like, it's just an ad. The judge sided with the beer company, determining the ads weren't fraudulent, they were just over-exaggerated, as most ads are. With that, the case was dismissed. But at least Budweiser knows their ads are working to get customers. One guy just took it way too seriously. And as you'll see, that's the trend in all these cases. People just get mad about the tiniest things. Like there was this one guy who got his panties in a twist over, well, his pants. In 2005, Roy L. Pearson was gearing up for his new job as an administrative judge in Washington, D.C. On May 3rd, he dropped off a pair of gray pants at a dry cleaner and asked them to be altered and dry cleaned for the nerve-wracking first day. The dry cleaner mixed up a few things and accidentally sent off Roy's pants to another dry cleaner. When the mistake was caught, the business contacted Roy, filled him in on the stitch, and told him they'd sort it out and scheduled a pickup as soon as possible. Roy was not pleased. These pants were supposed to complete his impressive first day fit, and now he was going to have to find another pair of pants to wear. When Roy's pants were finally ready to be retrieved, he showed up at the dry cleaner and was like, those aren't mine. Even though the dry cleaner had records and tags that matched Roy's receipt and the pants looked identical to the ones he dropped off. Hint, they were his pants. If this business really did misplace them, wouldn't you think they'd just offer a refund and pay him the cost of the pants or something? That would be super extra for them to go out and try to find a pair of pants that looked just like his. But that's kind of what Roy thought. So he went after the Chung family, the owners of the dry cleaner. Roy first approached them and asked for $1,150 so he could buy a new suit. The Chung said no, so Roy went to the DC Supreme Court to take legal action. He presented his case, focusing on the signs outside that said same-day service and satisfaction guaranteed. Roy claimed the business didn't live up to the expectations of either sign, so that's why he was going after them. Somehow, the judge decided to bring it to trial. In the beginning, the owners agreed to pay a settlement of $3,000, but that wasn't enough for Roy. You know, the guy who initially asked for $1,150. So the Chungs offered him $4,600. Still not good enough. $12,000. Nope, that wouldn't cut it. Roy was just trying to see how much he could squeeze out of this company. The judge even said the court has significant concerns that the plaintiff is acting in bad faith. By 2007, Roy had gotten the number up to $67 million. He was trying to sue this family for 67 million buckaroos for a pair of pants. Roy, who of course represented himself in court, claimed he needed that amount of money to cover the cost of his $395 pants, 10 years of rental car fees so he could drive to another dry cleaner, emotional damages, discomfort, inconvenience, and legal fees. There was no way Roy could prove his pants had been misplaced, but he sure kept harping on that satisfaction guaranteed sign on the front of the dry cleaners. Roy said he was not satisfied with the service, so he sued them for millions of dollars. Need I remind you, this man was starting a job as a judge. He was also an attorney. Well, Roy ended up reducing the amount down to $54 million, but at that point, what's a few extra $1 million, right? In the end, Roy lost his case and had to pay the Chungs legal fees, and thank God the Chungs won. They were dealing with so much financial and mental strain from this case, and they talked about moving back to South Korea. Roy ended up losing his job, so again he sued, this time for wrongful termination. He lost that case as well and later made an appeal, but that was dismissed. From what I could gather, Roy kept his license and is still practicing as a contract attorney at various law firms. Here's another interesting story for you. So there was a dude named Robert Lee Brock who was thrown in a Virginia jail for breaking and entering and grand larceny. Robert claimed the only reason he committed the crime was because he drank too much. And that's a typical excuse you hear from criminals, but what Robert did next was quite unique. He decided to sue himself. Robert claimed he violated his religious beliefs of not drinking any booze and demanded $5 million from himself. Well, actually, because he was in prison, he was demanding the money from the state. In his 7-page handwritten lawsuit, Robert said, "For violating my religious beliefs, I want to pay myself $5 million, but ask the state to pay it in my behalf since I can't work and am a ward of the state." He then gave a breakdown of the cost. $3 million was to compensate his wife and children for their pain and suffering, as well as college tuition. The other $2 million was to support him over the next 23 years he was set to serve in jail. He wrote, "When I get out, I'd pay it back to the state by court order." The judge didn't buy it and dismissed Robert's lawsuits. She said, "The plaintiff has presented an innovative approach to civil rights litigation. However, his claim, and especially the relief sought, are totally ludicrous." The last case I'm going to tell you about today might be the craziest of all. This one happened in northern China in 2012. A man named Jian Feng sued his wife because she gave birth to an ugly baby. And the worst part is, he won the lawsuit. So basically, this guy and his wife were super excited about having a child together. But when the wife gave birth to their daughter, Jian looked at it in disgust. He said the baby was ugly and accused his wife of having an affair. Jian kept pestering his wife about how hideous their child was and how he thought there was another baby daddy, so the wife finally came clean. But it wasn't about another man. The woman, who has chosen to remain anonymous, told Jian that she spent around $100,000 on plastic surgery to change her appearance before meeting him. So that was probably why the baby looked different than he expected. Jian claimed his wife schemed him into marrying her. He took her to court, and do you want to know what the judge ruled? Jian was in fact tricked into marrying this woman. He granted the couple a divorce and awarded Jian $120,000. Should this woman have told her husband about her plastic surgery before marrying him? Maybe. Was the guy even cute himself? Maybe not. And that is all I have to say about that case. I think that about does it for today's rapid fire of wacky lawsuits. And what better way to end this strange episode than with a hot dog that's stuffed inside a pickle and breaded on a stick. Don't forget the peanut butter on the side. Thanks for watching. Hello and welcome to Killer Bites, a true crime cooking show that's the perfect amount of crazy as it is delicious. If this is your first time watching Killer Bites, you may be taken aback by the combination of food and crime, but we found the two elements balance each other out pretty nicely. In today's episode, we'll be talking about Lord Lucan's disappearance while making the traditional British dish, bangers and mash. If you're curious, the recipe is in the description below. When Lord Lucan vanished one Thursday evening, tensions were high. His kid's nanny had just been executed in the basement, and his estranged wife was trying to frame him for it. He insisted he was innocent in the few exchanges he had that evening, but never showed himself ever again. Now it's been almost 50 years, and no one can say for certain what happened to Lord Lucan or where he went. I'm going to start off by heating up butter in a pan and sauteing onions. On the evening of November 7th, in 1974, a woman rushed into a London pub screaming, "Help me, help me, help me, I've just escaped from being murdered. He's in the house, he murdered the nanny." This woman was Veronica Duncan, or Lady Lucan. She was covered in vital fluid and very shaken up. She said her estranged husband, Richard John Bingham, aka Lord Lucan, just attacked the nanny and the kids were still there. Cops and medics immediately rushed to Veronica's home in Belgravia to check things out. The kids were in their rooms untouched, but when officials got down to the basement, that's when things got bad. Since there were no lights on, the officers shone their flashlights and made their way down. The walls were spattered in red fluid, and male footprints were tracked through the pools of fluid on the grounds. By the basement kitchen was a sack that also had red all over it. Because if you can't already tell, this was a gruesome scene. When officers looked into the sack, they found the lifeless body of Sandra Rivet, the family nanny. They assumed she had been bludgeoned with the bandage-wrapped lead pipe that was recovered in the hallway. Since Veronica was upstairs when the incident occurred, officers interviewed her at length. Here's what she said. That night, Sandra put the kids to bed and asked Veronica if she wanted a cup of tea. Veronica said yes, so at around 9 p.m., Sandra went down to the basement to make it. By 9:15, Veronica wondered what was taking Sandra so long, so she decided to go downstairs to check in on her. Veronica called out Sandra's name, but there was no response. Then, out of nowhere, a male came up from behind and whacked Veronica in the head with a lead pipe. Veronica naturally started to scream, which prompted the assailant to say, "Shut up." When she heard the man speak, Veronica knew it was her estranged husband, Richard. With that, Veronica grabbed Richard by the throat and started fighting back. Then she went straight for his moneymakers down below and squeezed as hard as she could. That's what freed her from his grip. Works like a charm every time. According to Veronica, she asked Richard where Sandra was, and he said he killed her. At that point, it was life or death. Veronica was worried that she and her 3 kids might meet the same fate as Sandra, so she had to think something up, and quick. Veronica told Richard that she could help him escape and led him upstairs. While Richard was in the bathroom cleaning up, it was the perfect opportunity for Veronica to escape, so she got out as fast as she could without even grabbing her kids. And that's when she ran into the pub. Once Veronica finished telling the police her account of events, she told them she thought Richard accidentally executed Sandra, thinking it was her in the darkness. After telling her side of the story, Veronica was rushed to the hospital to get medical attention for her intense head injuries, and police officers continued to search the scene. At 10:30 that night, Richard called his mother. He said something bad happened and he needed her to pick up his 3 kids. But when Richard's mom pulled up, police officers were everywhere. She filled the police in on the situation between Richard and Veronica, which is that they separated 2 years prior and were fighting over who got custody of the kids. Richard's mom told the cops that her son now lived in a flat nearby, and she took the kids home with her while the investigation continued. Obviously, the next move would be to interview Richard, so the police went to his flat, but he was nowhere to be found. Well, that's not suspicious at all. Inside, investigators found Richard's passport, wallet, checkbook, driver's license, glasses, and car keys. His blue Mercedes was still parked outside, but the battery was dead, and it apparently had been that way for a while. Later, officials found out Richard had been borrowing a Ford Corsair from a friend, and he had taken the car about 45 miles away to Upfield, Sussex. There, he showed up at the home of his friends Ian and Susan Maxwell Scott. Ian wasn't home, but Susan was. She opened the door and saw a disheveled Richard. Susan said he was still wearing his daytime clothing that looked stained and partially cleaned off. Daytime clothing? I guess there are different outfits for different times of the day when you're an aristocrat. Now I'm gonna add in coconut sugar and balsamic vinegar. Susan said Richard told her that his wife was framing him for a crime and he was gonna lie doggo, which is the 1970s British slang for hiding out or flying under the radar. Richard then gave Susan his account of events. He said he was walking in Belgravia that night when he stopped to look through the basement window, the one of his old home that he no longer lived in. This was a typical thing for Richard to do. At one point, he hired a private investigator to spy on his wife and kids. Anyway, Richard claimed he casually peeped in the window and saw Veronica being attacked by a man. Being the chivalrous lord he was, Richard let himself in the home and ran downstairs, but he slipped in a pool of fluid and Veronica's attacker got away. After that, Richard said he helped calm Veronica down and the two went upstairs to clean up. But as soon as he got into the bathroom, Veronica ran away screaming murder. At that moment, Richard realized things looked really bad for him, so to avoid being framed as a suspect, he fled. But he insisted he was innocent and came to the conclusion that Veronica hired a hitman to snuff the nanny and frame him for the crime. Okay, but if Richard really was innocent, running away makes him seem even more guilty. Richard made 4 phone calls that night that we know of. The first was to Madeline Florman, a friend and neighbor of his. Sometime after 10 p.m., Madeline woke up to the sound of her phone ringing. She answered and heard a man's voice on the other end. She said she thought it was Richard, but he sounded distressed and was incoherent. Tired and confused, Madeline put the phone down and went back to sleep. A little bit before that phone call, Madeline said someone was frantically ringing her doorbell, but she thought it was just some teens ding-dong ditching her. The following morning, she found spots of vital fluid on her doorstep, so it was theorized that Richard was the man at her door. The second phone call Richard made that night was the one to his mom where he asked her to pick up his kids. That was around 10:30 p.m. The third phone call was to a guy named Bill, who was married to Veronica's sister. So I guess that means Bill was Richard's brother-in-law, but since he and Veronica were separated, maybe that makes him his ex-brother-in-law? Whoever Bill was to Richard, he didn't answer. After that call is when Richard showed up at Susan's house. She let him in, and at 12:15 in the morning, Richard borrowed her phone to call his mom again. He wanted to check and make sure she got the kids. Richard's mom said yes, and then asked him to go to the police. He responded, "I'd rather not. I'll be in contact with them first thing in the morning." Yeah, right. Sometime around 1 a.m., Richard left Susan's home. She tried to convince him to stay so they could go to the police later that morning, but he just said he had to get back and he drove off, never to be seen again. Once this part of Richard's timeline was discovered, the police asked Susan why she never reported the visit. She claimed to have not known that he was wanted at the time, even though this story and Richard's name were unavoidable in the following days. Newspapers, TV reporters, and radio broadcasters were all talking about the high society aristocrat who is now a wanted criminal. Now let's put our bangers in the oven. So here are the only other things we know for sure about Richard's whereabouts. The next day, he postmarked 2 letters to Bill. And in the trend of this case, one of the envelopes had smears of red on it. In the first letter, Richard told the same story he told Susan and then asked him to watch over his kids. In the second, Richard gave Bill instructions about an upcoming sale that would satisfy bank overdrafts. Because even though the guy was high class, he was also a gambler who lost a few bets. He signed that letter as Lucky, which was a nickname his gambling friends called him, although I don't know how accurate that name is. Richard also sent a letter to Michael, a friend who lent Richard the car. Unfortunately, Michael threw away the envelope, so there's no way to tell when it was sent. Gee, thanks, Michael. In this letter, Richard asked Michael to tell his kids he cares about them. He didn't go into detail about what happened, but said, "Judging by my last effort in court, no one, let alone a 67-year-old judge, would believe, and I no longer care except that my children should be protected." Yo, I'm glad you love your kids, but if you truly love them, you wouldn't slay their nanny and try to do the same to their mom. 3 days after the incident, the Ford Corsair Richard was driving was found abandoned in New Haven. When officials searched the interior, they found fluid from at least 2 different people and a piece of lead pipe wrapped in a bandage. It was just like the lead pipe found in the basement at Veronica's house, but this one didn't have any stains on it. Is it just me, or does this feel like a real-life version of Clue? I think it was Lord Lucan in the basement with the lead pipe. What do you think? Well, after Richard left Susan's house that night, he was never officially seen again, although many people reported sightings. Now I'm going to make the mashed potatoes. I have my potatoes steamed and cut up, and I'm going to add milk and butter. Police officers issued a warrant for his arrest, and everyone was searching for the 7th Earl of Lucan. Anyone who lived in England at the time knew all about this case. It was a huge deal. Sadly, though, people were more fascinated by Lord Lucan's actions since he was a posh aristocrat. Which means Sandra's story didn't get as much coverage and respect as it deserved. The specific details of her situation are pretty tragic too. She typically had Thursdays off and would hang out with her boyfriend in the evening. This particular week, she swapped her days off, meaning she saw her boyfriend on Wednesday and was home to take care of the kids on Thursday, which is the day she was attacked and slain. Which brings us to the first of many questions that surround this case. Did Richard mean to whack Sandra that evening? Most people say no. Since Richard and his private investigator were essentially stalking Veronica and the kids, Richard would know their schedule. And if he knew Sandra was typically off on Thursdays, that would give him the perfect window of opportunity to go after Veronica. But that poses another question. Was Richard even the perpetrator? Although there are many elements of the story that point to Richard as the perp, there are also a few things that back up the opposite argument. A lot of Richard's friends said this attack was not like him at all. He would never go after someone with a weapon like that in such a violent manner. Yeah, and my mom never thought I'd pass high school. Sometimes people have a way of surprising you. Another thought brought up in conversation was that Richard would never mix up his wife of several years with a new nanny. Whoa, I didn't even think about that. On the other side of things, people emphasize how dark it was in the basement that night, and Sandra and Veronica were the same height, so it still is feasible for Richard to mix them up. So if Richard isn't the assailant, some case followers believe his side of the story, that Veronica hired a hitman and framed him. Others think Richard was the one who hired the hitman to go after his wife, but the hitman accidentally whacked Sandra instead of the intended target. As confusing as all of these theories about who killed who and about what the motive was, there was something much bigger that puzzled the world for decades. Where the hell was Lord Lucan? 3 years after the incident, Veronica wrote a letter that was published in the Daily Mirror, where she pleaded with Richard to just turn himself in already. But over time, she started to think he took his own life. This is the first main theory. Veronica believed her ex jumped off of a ferry, hoping he'd get caught under the propellers so he would never be positively identified. But there's another sub-theory that I like better. It's that, and I quote, Richard stuffed rocks in his pants after he realized his mistake. And then I'm guessing jumped in a body of water with those rocks in his pants. It's a very vague theory, but I'm here for it. The second theory is that someone helped Richard out of the country but realized it was super risky to be seen with him, so they whacked him and buried him in Switzerland. Theory number 3 is that he fled the country. The most popular destinations Richard is believed to have traveled to include South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, Ireland, France, and Greece. Yo, all those sound like great places to live in, so I wouldn't blame him if that's what he really did. This theory category is based primarily on sightings people reported over the years, but none of them have ever been officially confirmed. The Australia sub-theory, however, comes from Sandra's son Neil. When Neil eventually discovered that he was the son of the victim, he decided to conduct a thorough investigation of his own. In all of his sleuthing, Neil concluded that Richard is now Buddhist and living in Australia. Say what? Neil somehow found this 85-year-old English Buddhist man living down under and suspected him to be Richard. This is because the old man's friends say he has a mysterious past that does not add up, and a facial recognition test showed an 85% similarity between the old man and Lord Lucan. Neil recently presented his findings to Scotland Yard's cold case unit, and it is currently being investigated. And last, but certainly not least, the fourth theory, which is my personal fave. Richard took his own life and was fed to tigers. I thought Carol Baskin did that to her husband first. Looks like she took a page out of Richard's book. Two of Richard's closest pals said Richard went to a private zoo that was owned by his friend John. Rumor has it, Richard gathered a few people for a quick gossip sesh where he admitted to whacking Sandra. The group talked out the different outcomes, and at the end of the conversation, a pistol was brought out and Richard was encouraged to do the decent thing. Richard then went to another room, held the pistol up to his head, and pulled the trigger. After that, the zoo owner, John, apparently fed Richard to his tiger, Zora. OMG, this is blowing my mind right now. I had no idea there was another fed him to the tiger crime out there. When John's mom was asked about Richard, she said, "The last I heard of him, he was being fed to the tigers at my son's zoo." But when John was asked about the situation, he said, "My tigers are only fed the choicest cuts. Do you really think they're going to eat stringy old Lucky?" Boom, roasted. All right, here is a rapid fire of all the loose ends of the story. In 1975, an inquest jury ruled that Richard was responsible for Sandra's demise. In 1999, Richard was legally declared deceased. But it wasn't until 2016 when his official death certificate was released, and that's when his son assumed the title. And most recently, in 2020, Neil presented his Australia theory, which detectives say they're still looking into. And that about does it for the story of Sandra's demise and Lord Lucan's disappearance. Actually, there are so many more details about Richard and Veronica's relationship, possible sightings, and other crazy story spin-offs, but this plate of bangers and mash is ready, and I'm about to dig in. See you again soon!